This is a big one, skill stacking. And it's one of the principles that has really had a profound effect on my life. What is skill stacking? Well, in the book Mastery by Robert Greene, he mentioned that there's 3 approaches when it comes to career strategy. One is this idea of curiosity, that all masters of a craft stay in touch with their curiosity. They're always curious about your topic, and they have this childlike ambition to learn. The second is to value learning above all else. That is, choosing the opportunity that allows you to learn the best, such as accepting a job because you're going to be surrounded by people way smarter than you, instead of picking a job just because it has the highest salary. But the third point is the most important, and that is the idea of gathering skills and combining skills in a unique way. And that's what skill stacking is. Instead of getting good at one thing, you want to get good at multiple things and combining them, stacking your skills in different unique ways that is unique to you. By combining these different skills and experiences in a unique way, you can create a little niche for yourself where you're considered one of a kind. Because to really be a master of something, to be the top in the world at something, it requires a lifetime of dedication. For some people, that's easy, but there's only one spot in the world for a master. And the truth is, you probably will never be the best in the world at any specific skill. Not to disappoint you, but there's always going to be somebody working harder than you, spending more time than you. There'll always be somebody with better genetic gifts than you, maybe even more luck. But there's an advantage that can be had here. Maybe you're not the absolute best in the world. But with skill stacking, it's actually more effective to be in the top 20, top 10% in several different skills that you can stack together. That is completely unique to you so that you can be in the 1% in that skill. For example, if you're a programmer and you combine that with business skills or communication skills, that's going to make you more valuable. Your skills become more valuable when you stack them on top of one another. The key with skill stacking is to have skills that work well together, but that are also varied enough to make you stand out. And that's why I always recommend to not take the most frequent path or obvious path, which is usually the worst because it doesn't make you stand out. Like the example that I used of a programmer with good communication, presentation skills, or business logic is a lot more valuable than just a really good programmer. And that's the principle here. It's not about being the greatest at one thing. You just need to be pretty good at a list of useful skills that, when combined, make you truly one of a kind. Let's talk about happiness factors. Also, how cute are these dogs? I think this one's my favorite. What's yours? Anyway, let's get back to the topic here. The idea of happiness factors is to find, your key happiness factors. In order for you to be an efficient learner, to enjoy what you're doing, to enjoy growing and learning, you need to be happy. It sounds cheesy, but it's true. If you're in a negative space, if you're not in a good place in your life, you're automatically at a disadvantage in learning. You want to hit targets inside yourself that make you happy so that you can focus on these big goals and ambitions that involve learning, so that you can take risks and be okay with failing, to overcome obstacles because you are okay with those obstacles. And this is what I actually do in my daily life. I have 5 to 7 happiness factors that I always monitor. For example, look at your everyday life and think about what are the key things that make you happy. For example, for me, work is a big part of my happiness factor. Every day I work, and if work is not enjoyable, that's going to affect my happiness. Another one is friends and family, right? If I don't have good friend group, a good family, well, then I'm not going to be happy. Another one is learning and growth. I enjoy knowing that I improve every day, that I am learning something new every day, and that actually contributes to my happiness factor. Another one might be health and fitness, feeling healthy and energized each morning when I wake up and feeling like I can take on the world. Everybody has different happiness factors, but what I want you to do is to write down 5 to 7, that's it, only 5 to 7 happiness factors, and try to monitor them throughout your learning career. Because by making sure these happiness factors are met, you put yourself in a better state of learning. All right, we're turning into a self-help course here, but it is true. As cheesy as it sounds, this is something that if you write it down, will help you monitor, maintain, and improve over time. I'll see you in the next one. Bye-bye. What is your productivity time? You see, everybody is different. Although most jobs start at 9 and finish at 5, that's not the best way of doing things because some people are morning people. They love waking up early in the morning and they feel the most productive in the morning. And some people are just nighthawks. They love working at night, staying up late. What you want to do is to figure out what your productivity time is. For example, if you struggle to get out of the bed in the morning and you feel really groggy, then learning for you maybe shouldn't happen in the morning. It should happen later on in the day. Or if you're like me and you love going to bed early and waking up early, and the first 4 hours that you wake up, you feel the best, that's when you should structure your learning. The key is that there's no one better than the other. Every person is different, and your job is to figure out what your productivity times are. What area throughout the day are you the most productive? And making sure that moving forward, your learning that we're going to do is going to happen in those zones. Because if you're not a morning person and you say, I'm going to wake up at 4 a.m. every single day and learn, and it starts feeling like a chore, it doesn't feel good, and eventually after a month you give up because you're just not having fun, you're not enjoying it, you're not happy, then that habit isn't going to stick. So find your productivity time and give yourself the permission to study when you feel the best. Everyone is different. Let's talk about the principles. This section is all about changing your mindset. As we will discover later on in the science section of the course, our brains have this property of neuroplasticity. That is, it can evolve and change throughout our lives based on different actions and inputs we take. One of the first things we want to do to come out of the other end of the course a better learner who can succeed under any topic is to rewire our brain with some principles. Here's the thing with this section. This section is often confused a lot with self-help. It's kind of become a word that means this: make you feel good without actually accomplishing anything. That doesn't sound very fun, does it? Although this section will try and lay the critical thinking and foundation that we need for the rest of the course, I want you to be cautious here. These are the types of topics that often do just that, make you feel good without actually accomplishing anything. By just watching this section, you will not come out a better learner. Instead, we need to introduce these principles to make you realize some truths about the world we live in, so that you're ready for the future sections. This section may make you feel good, but without the rest of the sections, it won't do much for you. You may find these videos superficial and easy, but the idea here is to have these videos be a place where you can always come back to and be reminded of the principles to trigger what we learn throughout the rest of the course. Because this section is all about adjusting our brains to look at the world in a different way. From a place that we have no control over and we react to, instead to a place that we have control over and we can shape. Enough talk, let's get started. Let me ask you a question. When you were in school, did you care about your grades? Did you try to do things to improve your grades, improve your test scores, maybe your exam scores? I bet a lot of you would say, yes, I did as well. It is very rare that somebody goes to school and focuses on the learning or what they learn as the measure of success versus what grade they got. Or let me ask you this. You work in an office on a project with lots of people. Do you do things from the standpoint of learning, or do you do things to find a way to please your manager, your boss, or what gets the job done easily? This is the idea of learning versus winning the system. You see, when we go to school, these are places we're just playing a game of winning the system. That is, there's a certain structure within a school that allows you to succeed. That is, getting good grades on a test. And it's very rare that we often focus on long-term learning. That is, instead of going into a class thinking, how can I ace this test? Instead thinking, how can I retain this information? How can I learn from this class? For you to be an efficient learner, the focus must shift from simply winning a system, winning a game, to actual long-term learning, which might not make you feel good at the beginning. Maybe accepting a job that surrounds you with people smarter than you so that you can grow and learn long-term is a better strategy than winning the system and just trying to impress your boss, your manager, your friends. Keep this principle in mind when you encounter this option in your life. You have a choice to focus on long-term learning. Long-term learning, in the long term, will always beat out just winning the system. Let me just say that you suck. Whoa, okay. Don't go stopping the video saying, Andre, how dare you? I have a point to this, so bear with me. When we try something and at first we don't succeed, it doesn't feel good, does it? It doesn't feel good to suck. And this leads to our next principle. That is the obstacle. No matter what, when we learn any topic, we're going to encounter this obstacle that you suck. You can literally see how far you have to go to stop sucking. You can feel the distance between where I am now and where I want to be. And it's really frustrating, right? It feels like you'll never get there, like it's an impossible task. Maybe you think that it is possible to get to that end goal, but it just seems like it's going to take such a long time. It's so far away. Trying becomes just too much work. But I want us to shift this focus of obstacles. That is, when you encounter an obstacle, this idea or this voice in your head that says, no, you can't do it, or you suck. You want to change it to, good, I'm doing something worthwhile. Instead of our ego being protected because we don't want to suck, we want to change the focus to saying, good, I'm learning a skill that probably others are feeling the same thing. They're going to turn around, but that's not me. I'm going to keep going because this is what makes a skill, a topic, valuable to learn. Because nobody is good at anything at first, right? All the world's most successful people were beginners at their craft one time. Bill Gates couldn't code a time in his life. Elon Musk probably couldn't do any addition. All these people that we look up to, at first, were just beginners. When you take a test and get the wrong answer, and here's the truth. If you succeeded right away and you didn't encounter any obstacles, that's actually a bad thing because you won't learn the hard lessons that failures teach. The thing you want to do and the path you want to go on, the learning you want to do, the new career that you want to take, the new business that you want to start. Most people won't do them because of these obstacles. But the obstacles are the path that others abandon. What you do when you encounter those failures will define your future success. So shift your focus. When you see these words, enjoy sucking. When you feel like you suck, congratulations, you found something that people aren't willing to do. And this is what's going to make your skill valuable. Here's a brutal truth, and that is the dip. No matter what, when you start learning a new topic, or when you're trying to achieve mastery, there's going to be periods of low points where you feel like you're never going to get there. And we talked about that with the obstacles that we encounter, the obstacle principle. But here's another truth, and this is a brutal one, but you have to accept. There is a possibility that you're simply not cut out for the path ahead. Because not everybody can become anything. Some people are never going to be professional gymnasts. Some people are never going to be musicians, and some people are never going to be good coders or programmers. This does happen. And Seth Godin actually talks about this in his book, The Dip. It's what the book is about. You can try hard and do things and push through and have perseverance and drive. But sometimes the path might be a wrong pursuit for you. And it's just as important to know when to quit, to turn around and do something different, as it is to push and go over the obstacles. So I want to prepare you for that. When you hear you can do anything you set your mind to, sure, maybe. But we have limited capacity in our brains, as you will see. We have limited time on this earth. So the path that we pick has to be a smart path, a smart choice. Push enough so that you can overcome those obstacles, but also know when the dip is there and when you should turn around. Not very motivational, is it? But it's the truth. This is going to be a quick principle, and it's this idea of choice versus chore. It's a choice, not a chore to do something. When you have to think to yourself, I need to go exercise, and this feels like a chore, long term, you're not going to keep exercising because it's like washing dishes or doing laundry. Not many people enjoy those tasks, and we do it because we have to. But when it comes to learning, if it feels like a chore, you probably won't continue to do it. Because unlike clothes that get dirty or dishes that get dirty, there's no physical evidence of our lack of learning. So instead, we want to shift our focus and start thinking of learning as a choice. Chores are temporary and they won't last long. But if you start to shift your focus and realize that learning is a choice, you can not do anything today. You can take a rest for the rest of the week. That is a choice. Or you can say, I'm making a choice to learn every day for 20 minutes. When you shift that focus from chore, something that you have to do, to a choice, something that you will do, that you want to do, that shifts your focus. And long term, the choice will always beat out the chore. It's all in the frame. Framing is an important concept when it comes to learning because almost nothing in this world is objective. Most things are subjective. That is, we as humans interpret them in different ways. A bird might be beautiful to some, or a bird might be annoying and scary to others. Frames are what humans use to change perspectives. Almost everything in this world has different contexts or different frames that you can use to view things in a different way. And you may have noticed this. In this principles section of the course, these lessons are all about reframing the way we think, the way we look at things, the way we look at obstacles, the way we look at the choice and chore to learn. All of these things are allowing us to have a different perspective on the topic of learning. For example, when you encounter frustration when learning, when you feel like you suck, instead of feeling like, this doesn't feel good, I am just not good enough, notice this and say, oh, I am growing. This feeling is me growing as an individual, me learning and pushing, me overcoming an obstacle. This is the idea of a beginner mindset, not necessarily a beginner attitude. A beginner attitude is an attitude that says, I'm not good enough. I'll never get there. This is too difficult. I don't have time for this. Others are better than me at this. A beginner mindset instead reframes this idea of, I'm not there yet. Other people are better than me and I will learn from them so that I can get there. I have a choice to practice 20 minutes each day so that I can get to where I want to be. And I can get to that point where somebody that I respect is. That's the beginner mindset. And the idea of framing is exactly that. It's moving these dark, negative ideas where we don't have control over our future, over our life, over our learning, into shifting it and looking out from a different perspective, from a different frame of mind, having a beginner mindset instead of a beginner attitude. And this is what this section is about with the principles. The principles are meant to shift your focus, shift your perspective into what you can control instead of what we have no control over. Holy moly, you made it. This is our last principle, the self-learning paradigm. Now, up to this point, you might be thinking, what did I sign up for? This feels like a self-help course. There's a lot of woohoo magic here that makes me feel good, but nothing got accomplished. And I know, this part I would say was the toughest part to make because there is a lot of concepts that just simply shift your focus, shift your perspective, shift your frame. But what we've learned up until now can actually be combined into this idea of the self-learning paradigm. You see, at the core of self-learning is this idea of personal autonomy. To become a self-learner, an efficient learner, you must choose that path. At the end of the day, no matter what I tell you, how convincing I may be, it's your job to decide that this is the path you want to go on. You have to choose for yourself to be a self-learner. Nobody's going to tell you to learn a topic, to improve your skills, to develop further and further each day. That is a choice that you have to make. Sure, you're going to have external factors like changes in your job or maybe breakups or maybe different promotions at your job. Sometimes you may find that a skill you're learning is no longer fun and you want to pursue something different. You want to learn a new skill instead of improving on an existing one. The idea of the self-learning paradigm is that you need that intrinsic motivation. You need to, from inside of yourself, decide that this is what you want to do. And that is the choice that you make. That you will continue to learn each day, to be an efficient learner each day. And that motivation cannot be taught by me, cannot be convinced by some random person on YouTube or a random book. That has to come from within. But because you're already in this course, you're already watching these videos, I'm willing to bet that you have that inner motivation, which luckily is going to take you very far. Let's move on. Woohoo! Congratulations getting this far. Now, in this section, we talked about the principles. That is, we tried to adjust our brains, our perspectives, to look at the world in a different way. From a place that we have no control over, that we react to a place that we have control over. We have choices and choices that we can shape. We talked about the idea of learning versus winning the system, where instead of finding a way to just get good grades just because you want to do well on a test, to focus instead of this idea of long-term learning. What will help you learn in the long term? We talked about this idea of what is success, that everybody has a different idea of success, but being smart doesn't necessarily mean that we're going to be successful. You need to have that drive and passion to lead to success. We learned about the obstacle and how we want to shift our focus from whenever we feel that insecurity, that we're not good at something, that we suck, that those are actually things that are going to make us better, that make our skills worthwhile. Most people are going to turn around when they see an obstacle, but that's not you, and you're going to push forward because that's what makes you valuable and unique. We learned about the idea of the dip, and sometimes we need to understand when we need to turn around and try a different path. We learned about compound learning and this idea that you don't have to just necessarily go all out and study 12 hours a day. Instead, it's all about small, little daily learnings that are going to make you successful and an efficient learner in the long term. We learned that failures don't count against us, that we can fail 100, thousands, millions of times. All that matters is where we are now in our current state. And the more failures we have, the more feedback we're going to get to improve. We learned about choices versus chore and how we want to view learning as a choice, not a chore. We learned about this idea of framing, to frame and look at things as a way for us to grow and improve instead of in a negative light. That's what we did with the obstacles, right? We learned about this important principle, the Pareto principle of the 80-20 rule, that we don't necessarily need to get to 100% right from the bat. Instead, it's about this idea of what are the vital things, the 20% that accounts for 80% of our results. Something that we're going to use in our learning strategy later on in the course. We learned about this exciting idea of skill stacking, that we don't have to spend our entire lives getting good at one thing, which is really, really difficult. There's always going to be people smarter than us that work harder than us. But with skill stacking, we can make our different skills, the combination of skills, unique so that we stand out and we become valuable. We learned that we need to make sure that we're happy within ourselves, that our happiness factors are taken care of so that we have the foundation to learn and do well and continue to learn. We figured out that we each have our own productivity time, and by now we know when our learning should happen within a day. And then finally, we learned about this idea of the self-learning paradigm, that to be a self-learner is a choice. You have to be motivated to continue to learn, and that no amount of money or external rewards or pats on the back that we get from our friends is going to make us become an efficient learner, a strong self-learner. We have to be motivated and decide that starting today, we take learning as a priority in our lives, and you're going to make the choice to become a self-learner, to continue to learn and have learning be a part of your daily practice. We now have the principles in place to move on to the course. Like I said, it does feel like we just learned a ton of topics that you can find in self-help books and self-help videos and courses. But this is important because we now should have the foundation that shifts our focus to turn on to more and more exciting things. And these videos are nice and short so that you can always come back to every once in a while and remember some of the principles whenever you feel like you don't want to learn, whenever you feel like you're not happy, whenever you feel like you have doubts. These videos are here for you to come back to and be reminded of the important principles that will take you far in your learning career. I'll see you in the next one. Bye-bye. Welcome back. We just learned about the principles, the shift in mindset, in our frame of mind, and how we can prepare ourselves for efficient learning. And now we're ready to move on to the next part of our pyramid, and that is the lies. In order for us to keep moving, we have to debunk some myths when it comes to learning. Some advice that is often given turns out to actually not be true. It's just bad advice. And these are the things you've most likely heard about, but may have assumed that it's true. So we're going to tackle these lies in this section so that moving forward, we know how to avoid them. Combined with the principles, once again, this is going to set us up for later sections in the course. Let's get started. Let's talk about the first lie, and that is the advice that is often given to follow your passion. It sounds poetic. It sounds nice, doesn't it? Who doesn't want to follow their passion? It makes us feel good. It just sounds right. But this advice is often not a good advice. In one of the best books I've ever read by Cal Newport, titled So Good They Can't Ignore You, Cal gives the advice that passion is simply overrated. For example, when I was younger, I was passionate about travel. I love to travel and visit different countries. So I thought, maybe I should get into the travel industry because I'm passionate about travel. And it took me years to realize that just because I liked doing something like travel doesn't mean that that's what my work career needs to be as well. Because I may be passionate about something that I enjoy purely as a leisure activity. As soon as it turns into work, that leisure activity that was fun, that you were passionate about, turns into a chore. And we want to turn our attention from following our passion to working hard at something, learning a valuable skill, and getting better and better and better. And that act of getting better at something, getting smarter, getting more and more recognition, having more people recognize you as an expert, that act of self-improvement and that act of self-recognition is what actually makes you enjoy your job, enjoy your skills, and enjoy your career. And that's often true. Many people who actually love what they do don't have a passion for it. For example, I'm a software engineer. Can I say that I'm passionate about coding and programming? Not really. I'm not really passionate about it, but I enjoy the process of getting better and better. And the more success I had in my career, the more I enjoyed it, the more I became passionate about the topic. But this wasn't an innate thing in me. I just forced myself to learn something that I thought was difficult and valuable. All you need is a little bit of interest in a topic. And once you have that little bit of interest, then by learning and improving over and over, it becomes more and more enjoyable because you go from a beginner to somebody that has a valuable skill that somebody respects. So you don't need passion. What you actually need is creativity, control, and impact. That's what we want when we talk about a skill that we have. If we're able to be creative with our skill, if we're able to have control over our lives and dictate what we work on, if we're able to have impact in the world and do something worthwhile, if we combine those three things with a valuable skill set, that passion arises. So the passion mindset should be trashed. Don't ask about what the world can offer you, what is my passion and what is my destiny. Instead, tell yourself that getting better is a craft, learning is a craft, and learn to love the process of getting better and better. This is called the craftsman mindset. And the craftsman mindset asks, how can I improve and have something uniquely valuable to offer the world? Am I willing to push through this, go past the obstacles, despite how tedious, hard, or boring a process may be? The craftsman mindset says, instead of just following my passion and finding that perfect job, instead, work hard, put your head down, learn a valuable skill, combine different skills, and get really, really good. Get so good that they can't ignore you. You need to earn that great skill, great career, and the world doesn't owe you anything. The process won't be easy, but the process and the hard work is what gets you there. Let's talk about the next lie, and that is that you can avoid risk when becoming successful or when improving at something and becoming an expert in a field. The truth is that you can't avoid risk. Risk is part of the process. To really achieve anything worthwhile, you have to be able to tolerate and enjoy taking risks. Enjoy those butterflies that you get in your stomach when you're doing something that you're not comfortable with. Maybe you're about to give a speech in front of 100 people. Does that feel good? No, it doesn't feel good. You get those butterflies in your stomach. You get sweaty palms. Your heart starts beating faster. When you notice those butterflies in your stomach, that's when you know you're stretching your boundaries. That's when you know you're doing something that others aren't willing to do. You're doing something that improves you, makes you better. And anybody that plays it safe, doesn't take any risks in their life, are going to be left behind by those that take those risks. Because as we've learned in our principles, it doesn't really matter how often you fail. What matters is that last success that you had. So start viewing risks as challenges to look forward to. And in all fields, in all careers, in all topics and skills. In order to make exceptional discoveries or leaps in skill, you need to have risk. And this topic of taking risks is something we'll come back to later on in the technique section of the course. But remember this, you can never play it safe. If you want to do anything worthwhile, if you want to improve a skill and learn efficiently, you will have to take risks. You will have to give up something to improve at another thing. But don't worry, you don't need to go bungee jumping or anything. Me personally, there's no way I'm ever going bungee jumping, but there's other risks that I can take. I'll see you in the next one. Bye-bye. All right, we're halfway there. 2 more risks to go. And this one is a very simple one. Trust this one person. Why is this a bad advice? Well, because we tend to always look up as humans to leaders, right? We tend to look at people like Jeff Bezos or Steve Jobs and think, wow, they have everything figured out. They're so successful. They're just such leaders in their field. And as humans, it's very easy for us to look up to somebody and believe and think that everything they say is true. Everything they say is gospel. That any advice that they give is right for us. And this happens a lot in any field, really. Even right now, me teaching you the topic of efficient learning, of learning how to learn, you're listening to one person to give you advice. But you have to remember that each person gives advice based on things that worked in their life, their experiences, which are unique to them. And one of the best things you can do in your learning journey is not to just blindly follow the one person that you see, that you trust. Create the muscle to not always agree with one person. Create the muscle of looking at different opinions and different individuals and teachers to learn from, because everybody has a unique perspective. Yes, maybe there is a role model that you want to learn from. Maybe Roger Federer, one of the top tennis players in the world, is who you want to learn tennis from. But oftentimes, people that tell you, hey, I'm the only person you should listen to, I'm the one that's going to get you to success, are often charlatans or what we call liars that are just trying to take advantage of you. And I know how hypocritical it is that I'm telling you don't listen to one person, even though I'm teaching a course on efficient learning. But what I'm saying is when you're learning a topic or even learning how to learn, don't just learn it from me. Reach out to multiple sources. Read from different writers, authors, because combining each individual piece from multiple people is a better way to learn than just getting all your information from one source. So remember, never trust just one person. Form your own opinions, methods, and tactics and techniques to learning that is unique to you based on multiple sources of information. You will often find that the people who have really strong, hard opinions on something are often the people who are less knowledgeable. Most successful learners or most people with really successful skills understand that there's usually pros and cons to everything. The people who tell you that they know everything are often the ones that know the least. Let's talk about the final lie. And that is the very famous 10,000 hours rule. Now, for those that don't know, this 10,000 hour rule was popularized in the book Outliers by Malcolm Gladwell. But it actually stems from a 1993 study looking at violinists. And the study was all about what makes a violinist an expert and what makes a violinist just a good violinist. So that is, what's the difference between the top masters when it comes to violins and the ones who were just okay or good enough? And this 1993 study was really exciting because what it reported was that those who were considered elite were the ones who practiced the most. This idea of deliberate practice, which we're going to get into the techniques section. So the answer was simple. Simply just practice more. The more you practice, the better you get. That's it. And it sounded nice, right? As humans, this was a nice concept to understand because the idea was if you put in 10,000 hours into a skill, then you become a master of it. However, over the years, even though this concept has become really popular, many studies have actually debunked this. And a recent study in 2016 combined all these studies and looked at this original study to analyze it and see if it was accurate. And it turns out that it wasn't really. Yes, practice matters. We can't forget that. Practice is a very important part of improving a skill. However, there are many different factors involved. Things like genetics, your past history, like your upbringing, your school, your friends, your personality actually contributes to how good you can get at a topic. And that doesn't sound exciting, right? Because it sounds like we have less control over what we can learn. With the 10,000 hour rule, we could say that, hey, anybody can do anything that they want, which is just such a nice thing to hear. But unfortunately, the truth of the matter is that we don't play in an even playing field in this world. When you think that it's unfair that you want to play basketball but you're short, well, that's life. Life is unfair. Not everybody starts at the same level. When you think it's unfair that somebody with wealthy parents can go to a really nice school, go to expensive schools like Harvard, well, that is not fair, but that is life. Everyone has advantages and disadvantages, and it's unrealistic for us to think that everyone is starting at the same place. But I don't want to leave this section making you feel like, well, I have less control over my future, my skills, and my learning. Because in fact, knowing this actually helps us. Because what we'll learn in this course is the idea that you don't have to be the hardest worker. You don't have to be the person that puts in 80 hours a week of work. We're going to focus on efficient learning. And efficient learning is all about learning smart. Instead of just banging our head, working as hard as we can, and exhausting ourselves in the process, we focus on efficient learning. What are the things that we can do so that instead of just blindly studying something for 10,000 hours, how can we shorten that period? How can we use the things that we have to our advantage? And knowing that we don't play on an even playing field, how can we strategize? And how can we use different techniques to actually get to a place where we become masters? So the good news is that although it's not as simple as just practicing, we can use the upcoming sections in the course to actually develop skills that allows us to learn efficiently versus learning hard. Instead of going to the gym for 2 hours each day, we can get the same results with 20 minutes each day. It's the same principle, the idea of efficient learning. And we're going to dive deeper and deeper into this topic. For now, take a break, and I'll see you in the next video. There we have it. We completed another section of our pyramid, and this part was all about the lies when it comes to learning. We learn about the advice of following your passion is probably not good advice. And instead, if you shift your focus to getting so good that they can't ignore you, with a skill that you get better and better at, you get more autonomy, you get more respect, you get more control over what type of work you do. And with more and more of that, you actually develop a love for the skill. It becomes more enjoyable to do what you do. Just following your passion blindly is probably not good advice. Next, we learned that you can't avoid risk. Risk is part of life. And those that do great things, those that are able to achieve things which involve learning, most likely involve risk. It involves making some sacrifices. It involves maybe training up an opportunity for another opportunity. And when we get those butterflies in our stomach, that means we're doing something worthwhile. We also learn not to trust just one single source of truth. When we blindly follow somebody and think that everything they say is true, well, it often leads us into a very one-dimensional way of thinking. We have the power of the internet where we're able to learn from different sources, from different instructors and teachers. Use that to your advantage and form your own opinions and thoughts. And also remember that nobody knows everything completely. And most likely the ones with the strongest opinions are the ones that are least knowledgeable. Finally, we learned about the famous 10,000-hour rule. That is, to get good at something, it's all about just working hard and putting in those hours. But it turns out that's not really the case. There's different factors that affect our ability to learn. And there are efficient ways to learn and not so efficient ways to learn. Two people that spent 10 hours learning a topic are most likely going to end up a different level of knowledge at the end of 10 hours based on different factors. Some factors are out of our control, but there are definitely factors that we can control, which is what we're going to explore later on in this course. The idea of this section was to throw these lies out there and understand that whenever you hear advice like this, it's most likely wrong. And hopefully by the end of this section, we now have the skills to flag whenever we notice this out there when we learn a topic. And instead, realize that these are no longer the rules that are going to dictate our learning. I'll see you in the next one. Bye-bye. Welcome back, everybody. We're getting there. We've talked about the principles, how to shift our mindset about learning. We talked about the lies, which were often bad advice given when it comes to learning. And now we're at a crucial point in the course, and that is the pillars. We're going to be talking about the 4 pillars, which are going to be the foundational concepts that allow us to learn about the science and the techniques when it comes to efficient learning. These pillars are going to finalize our mental model and set us up for the last 2 sections when we actually develop the skills to become efficient learners, to become smart learners. These pillars are what connects all the techniques we're going to learn into one. Because you'll notice that all the techniques actually stand on these 4 pillars. And every time we remember these 4 pillars, even after we're done with the course, you're going to be able to remember these techniques because each of the techniques are going to be standing on one of these pillars. But enough talk. I've said pillars way too many times. I think it's time for us to understand what are these foundational concepts that makes us stand out from the rest. Let's talk about the first pillar. And this is an important one. Everything is a game. What does that mean? To me, this is one of the most important foundations for being an efficient learner. It is something so profound that has had a tremendous impact on my life in a positive way. You see, when we frame our mindset to think that everything is a game, we inadvertently allow 2 things to happen in our lives. The first one is this idea of a growth mindset. Now, the opposite of a growth mindset is called a fixed mindset. And what we want to have to be efficient learners is a growth mindset. And that is that we believe talent, intelligence aren't just gifts that we're born with. Everything that you learn is trainable. Everything you do or things you want to learn can be learned. The idea is that with enough effort and strategy, you can get better at anything. Now, yes, I know that we learned that not all of us start in the right place and some are more advantageous than others. Maybe we go to a better school. Maybe we have better physical talents. But at the end of the day, when it comes to learning and using our brains, everything is trainable. And that's what a growth mindset is. A growth mindset is the belief that intelligence can be developed. And students with a growth mindset understand this. They can get smarter through hard work and the use of an effective strategy or strategies. As opposed to a growth mindset, some people have a fixed mindset. And that's the belief that intelligence is a fixed trait. that is set in stone at birth. You're either born smart or you aren't. And those are the type of people that make excuses, right? They believe that they cannot get smarter, so they avoid doing things that make them look dumb. And this essentially leads students to avoid challenges and tasks that actually help them grow. Instead, they just give up as soon as they struggle. But when we hold a growth mindset, when we think, hey, everything's a game, we're just improving constantly, people can now look at the world around them as an exciting place to grow and embrace these challenges and opportunities that come your way. This is what we need to develop mastery. In her book, Mindset by Carol Dweck, she talks about this idea of growth versus fixed mindset. When a fixed mindset person approaches a challenge, he or she usually thinks, hey, will I look smart or stupid while doing this? Instead, when a growth mindset approaches a challenge, he or she usually thinks, how might I learn and grow from this challenge? A fixed mindset person, when they encounter an obstacle or something difficult, is going to say, I'm not smart enough to do this. I can't do this. Versus a growth mindset person will think, I'm not smart enough to do this yet. When we view everything as a game, we realize that we learn, we adapt. Our player in this world gets more and more experience points as they encounter challenges. So that's the first thing that happens, this idea of a growth mindset when we view everything as a game. The second is this idea of control over life, or what psychologists call locus of control. What does that mean? In psychology, locus of control means to what degree people believe that they have control over outcomes and events in their lives. People that have a strong internal locus of control or believe that they have a lot of control over their lives, believe events in their lives derive from their own actions. For example, when you receive a test score, somebody with a strong locus of control usually blame themselves. They know that it was their fault for not doing well on a test, and they know that they could probably improve and they need to put in a better effort next time. Somebody who has a lower locus of control, or what we call an external locus of control, tend to blame factors outside of themselves, such as the teachers. The teacher didn't teach me well enough. This course didn't teach me well enough. Or I didn't have time because I was so busy with other things in my life. They blame everything around them and never blame themselves. When you start realizing that you have control over your life, when you start realizing that everything is a game, and just like in a game, we control our player, we control our destiny, you are better prepared to be an efficient learner. Exams and tests suddenly don't mean anything. Grades don't really mean anything, right? Sure, they give you feedback. But at the end of the day, all that grades and tests and exams are is a system. We're just learning how to optimize a system and we get a score back. If we believe that we have control over our lives, that we have a growth mindset, that we can improve our intelligence, this is all just a game. This is our player in a game that has failed a few times and just gets back up and improves each time. Because we learned that nobody remembers your failures. I remember my very first university test, I got 10% on that exam. But nobody really cares about that, do they? You only need to be successful a few times in life, and the rest of the times you can fail. And when you start viewing everything as a game, it changes your whole perspective to learning. Instead of thinking, I'm not smart enough to do this, it becomes, I'm not smart enough to do this yet. And the first step to going from a fixed mindset to a growth mindset is to realize that your brain can change. And this is something that we're going to explore in the science of the brain. But just as a sneak peek, yes, your brain actually grows and changes throughout your life. One famous study was done on taxi drivers in London. And researchers noticed that The more times a London taxi driver has spent driving a taxi in London, the larger a region of their brain associated with spatial awareness and memory, which was the hippocampus, we'll get to that, had actually grown. So what they learned is that as these drivers drove more and understood their landscape more, the roads more, the region of that brain actually grew. And more studies are showing that brains can actually adapt. You can speed up your brain circuits. And that's the thing. Everything is a game isn't necessarily just a mindset. It's the truth. Our brains grow. Our brains adapt. And if we believe that, and if we start to realize that, the way we look at learning really shifts. Learning new skills is a great tangible way to realize that you have control. For example, even the act of learning how to change a tire on a car actually increases your mindset that you have control over our lives. Instead of seeing events as things that happen to us, they become simply challenges that we need to overcome. So remember, everything is simply just a game. Let's talk about the second pillar. And the second pillar is the Feynman technique. Now, the Feynman technique is named after Richard Feynman, a famous Nobel Prize-winning physicist who was renowned not only for being extremely smart, but also for his ability to explain things to beginners very well. And this pillar is important because throughout the rest of the course, we want to keep this in the back of our mind. You see, the Feynman technique says that if you want to really understand something well, to really know a topic, you need to be able to teach it. Explaining something in a simple to understand way is the best way to actually learn, but also to test your knowledge. A good way that I like to think about this is speaking with a young child. When you're talking to a child, you get asked the question, why, all the time. Why do birds fly? Why do they have wings? You keep coming up with the answer and the child always goes, but why? And the Feynman technique is all about bringing down a concept to its basic level. To understand a concept or a topic, you need to be able to explain it to a child in simple terms. Often in our world, especially when you go to work or in a business setting, we try to use big words to sound knowledgeable. And these big words or jargon allow us to hide behind perhaps some uncertainty that we have. When we stop speaking with jargon, with difficult business speak or big words, when we speak in simple terms to others, it actually frees us from hiding behind knowledge that we pretend to have. For example, if I was a programmer, I might speak in a way to my managers to sound like I'm smart, to use complex terms that I know they don't understand, just to pretend that I know what I'm talking about. The Feynman technique actually goes against this. The idea is to become a good learner, to understand a topic. You want to be able to explain it in simple terms. And when you start realizing that explaining things in simple terms actually makes you a better learner, we shift our focus from trying to hide our knowledge from others to showing others how much we know. So moving forward, as we're developing our skill to learning, see if you can test yourself. See if you can explain a topic that you're learning to somebody with zero knowledge. If you can't, go back to the drawing board and figure out what you are missing in your knowledge to be able to explain to a child. Let's talk about the next pillar, and that is trunk-based knowledge. Trunk-based knowledge is this idea that in order for us to be efficient learners, to be successful learners, to have successful careers, we must first start from the roots, from the trunk of the tree, before we get to the leaves. What does that mean? Well, most of us think that to get really good at something is we learn one thing, then we learn another thing, and then we learn another thing. Let's say, for example, you want to learn how to play the guitar, and then you also want to learn how to build a house, and then you also want to learn how to program. Trunk-based knowledge instead says that instead of working from these leaves, we want to start at the roots, at the trunk, and form that trunk in order to develop our knowledge. But what does that really mean? Well, the idea is that we need to first start with the fundamentals, the principles, when getting started on a subject. For example, if you're learning to program, you might want to know how a computer works, or why do we use computers for certain tasks and humans for other tasks. This idea of fundamentals, of the why of something, is really important. Because when we just start learning, let's say playing the guitar, and we don't understand the fact that there's different chords that we can use, that some chords can be repeated to create music, or we don't know anything about reading a music sheet, that's actually going to make your learning a lot tougher long term. Instead, with trunk-based knowledge, we want to start from the principles, be able to answer the question why, the fundamentals of that topic. And as we move on through the course, you'll notice that we really focus on this trunk-based knowledge of understanding the principles and the why of things before we dive deep into smaller little techniques. We want to view knowledge as a form of tree, making sure that we understand these trunks, these fundamental principles, before we get into the leaves or the details. Because we live in a world that knowledge is constantly being updated and changed. And when we start learning the principles, the fundamentals, those are the things that actually last a long time over your career. Versus the leaves that constantly turn with each season, new leaves form. So instead of learning quickly expiring knowledge that are the leaves, we want to focus on knowledge that lasts forever or as long as possible. And when we start with that, no matter how the trends change, no matter how society changes, we have that trunk to develop skills as they change to adapt to the current society. Let's talk about our last principle, and that is that efficiency trumps grit. And this is great news for those that always think, I'm never going to work as hard as this person, or I'll never be able to put in the time as this person. This is going to be good news for you, because to be good at learning, to be good at a task or a skill, you don't have to actually be the hardest worker. You don't have to constantly be on and constantly be productive. Every single day when you wake up, you have to wake up at 4 a.m. and work all day until 9 p.m. and then go to sleep and repeat. We live in a society right now where there's a lot of type A personalities. That is, there's a lot of people with a lot of drive, a lot of grit to constantly learn, to constantly push so that they're successful. And we keep hearing these terms all the time of, oh, I'm so busy. How's your day? Well, it's been a busy day. How was your weekend? Oh, I was really busy with work. I was really busy with family. I was really busy with this and that. This idea of being busy now is seen as a badge of honor in our societies. Being busy is a good thing. But the truth is, being busy just shows that you have lack of time management skills. And what you'll discover is that efficient learning isn't about being the absolute hardest worker. It's about being smart with your time. It's all about being efficient. And efficiency trumps grit. You can be a person that studies for 80 hours a week. Do nothing but study. Work harder than anybody else in the world. But if you're not using the right strategies, if you're not using the right methods and learning the right topics, then you'll actually be surpassed by somebody that spends less time than you because that person is being more efficient. Hopefully that's why you're taking this course, right? Because if learning was all about volume and how much learning you can do, well, then anybody can do that. It's all about putting in the time. But we have limited time in our lives. We have limited skills that we can acquire in our life. So we want to be as efficient as possible with our time and use the right strategies the right methods to learn the skills that we need to be successful. And this is great news. Efficiency trumps grit. If you use the right strategies, you can get ahead of others. And luckily, most people don't spend the time like you are doing now actually learning how to be an efficient learner. I hope this gets you excited because now that we're done with the pillars, we're going to get into actual science and techniques for us to become these efficient learners. I'll see you in the next one. Bye-bye. There we have it, the 4 pillars. Up to this point, we've talked a lot about ideas and principles, but we haven't really gotten to the nitty-gritty techniques to become efficient learners. We're now ready, and we have the foundation to get into the science and then finally the techniques. But in this section, we learned some valuable lessons that are going to carry you throughout your career. The first pillar that we learned was that everything is a game. This idea that we should have a growth mindset, that our brains are constantly evolving, and we have control over our lives. We are a character in a game that can improve, that can get experience, that can get better and better with effort and time. We learned about this idea of having control over our lives, that things that happen to us can be determined by ourselves. We have the control. When we get a bad grade on a test or exam, that is our fault. We can improve that. By making excuses on external factors that you have no control over, we have no way to improve. And by viewing everything as a game, we are now a character in a game. We take things less serious, and we also learn that each obstacle that we encounter is an opportunity for us to grow and try again the next time. 1 failure doesn't mean anything. 90 failures doesn't mean anything. Each time we get right back up and continue on with our game. Next, we learned about the Feynman technique. The idea that in order for us to really understand a topic, we need to be able to explain it. If you don't understand something, ask questions. If something is confusing to you, well then research it and understand it, because we need to be able to get to a point where we can explain it to a beginner. Because if we're not able to explain something, then we don't truly understand it. We then learned about the trunk-based knowledge. The idea that knowledge is constantly evolving. The world we live in is so fast-paced that something that you learn now may not be relevant 10 years from now. Instead, we want to focus our knowledge on first creating the roots and the trunk, the fundamental principles that last a long time, that can be used 10 years from now to develop more and more knowledge. Finally, we learned some good news. That is that efficiency trumps grit. It's not about who works the hardest, who puts in the most time. It's about who uses time efficiently. It's not about being busy, but it's about being efficient and knowing how to use the right strategies to grow in the most optimal way. By using these pillars, we now have the foundation to really excel our learning. And by keeping these in the back of our minds, every time we encounter a new task, a new challenge, or we want to switch careers and learn a new skill, by using these pillars, we now have a jumping off point, a place where we can start to formulate a plan of attack to learn that new skill. All right, that's a lot of talking from me. I think it's time for us to dive into the science. What does the latest research tell us about learning and how to learn? This is going to be a fun one, so stay tuned and I'll see you in the next section. Bye-bye. We've now talked about the principles, the way that we should think about learning, how to change our mind and our perspective, our framing to be able to learn efficiently. We then discussed some lies, some common things that we hear that are often bad advice. And then we learned about the pillars, the foundations that are going to allow us to really take on these next 2 parts. And the next one is the science. This is a very exciting part because this is where we actually learn how the brain works. What's the latest research when it comes to how we learn? How can we use latest research and studies to be more efficient with our learning, to understand what's good for learning and what's bad for learning? Now, in this section, we're going to have a lot of resources and studies that we're going to link to that you can explore more on your own. But the goal is that by the end of this section, you're going to know how your mind works and how to use that knowledge to be an efficient learner, how to train your brain so that it works efficiently. And the reason that we didn't start the course with the science, which seems like the natural way to start, was that in order for us to really make use of the science by just learning a bunch of facts and a bunch of studies, we now have the foundation necessary through the principles, the lies, the pillars to identify what we need to be efficient learners. And now, combined with the science, it's going to allow us to be prepared for the last section, which is the techniques, where we finally learn the techniques necessary to be efficient learners. It's going to be a fun one, so let's get started. Let's talk about diffuse mode of thinking and focused mode of thinking. This idea was recently popularized by scientist Barbara Oakley on learning how to learn. And her colleagues' description of focused versus diffused mode of thinking has had a profound effect on the science of learning. It's so important that we're starting off this section with this topic. So, what does it all mean? Barbara Oakley and her colleagues discovered that there are two states that our brains can be in. One is a focused mode. Focus mode is when all your energy is completely focused on a task. Like when you're taking an exam. You're locked in your room and focused on one thing. Nothing else around you really matters. Your brain does just one thing. And it's so focused that, again, 100% of that attention is going to one thing. That's what focus mode is. Your brain power and attention goes to one activity. It's like you have a laser and that laser is pointing to one thing. And the focus mode of thinking actually activates the prefrontal cortex of your brain. That is right here over here, the front part of your brain. Now, the other mode, which is the diffuse mode, is a little bit different. Diffuse mode is, well, the opposite. It's when your brain is just daydreaming, thinking of different things. We let our minds wander. And in this case, many different areas of the brains are activated. Instead of just the prefrontal cortex, it's all regions of the brain are being activated. You can think of this as, instead of a laser, a flashlight that has lights just dispersed in different areas so that you can see more of an area when it's dark outside. Things like going for a walk or even sleeping actually activate the diffuse mode of thinking in our brain. So let me ask you this. Which mode makes you a better learner? Pause the video and try to guess. Ready? All right, this was a trick question. Most of you might have thought that focus mode is obviously the better method for learning. Actually, what Barbara Oakley and her colleagues discovered is that how well you learn depends on going back and forth between focus and diffuse mode. And this jump of going back and forth is what actually creates efficient learning. The idea is to spend dedicated time on focus mode, and then after a bit of time, when you can't focus and you're getting a little tired, you go into diffuse mode. You go for a walk, you let your mind wander, you just go out in nature. You see, the way our brains work is that we can't form strong neural connections, which we'll get into, and just become experts overnight. You can't just turn your brain from knowing to not knowing. It takes time. You can't become an expert overnight, right? We need to focus and create those strong connections in our brain, followed by letting our brain rest and make sure that those connections are created properly. This idea is actually covered in Cal Newport's book, Deep Work. When you focus intensely on a single subject for a period of time, you start forming something called the white sheaths on your brain cells. And these are called myelin. Let's take a look. If we look at an image of a neuron, which is what forms our brain, these are cells that are connected to one another, and that's how we get knowledge. You see that they have something called the myelin sheath over here. And these myelin sheaths actually allow for the signals and connections to travel faster and more efficiently through these different neuron cells because, well, we have a lot of neurons in our brain. When we use the diffuse mode of thinking, when we relax and let our mind wander or even fall asleep, it lets our brain create these myelin sheaths to make those connections more efficient. So this means by going back and forth between focus mode and diffuse mode allows our brains to grow and build our brain like a muscle. So that studying a little bit every day is actually better than trying to cram everything all at once. And that's what Barbara Oakley discovered. By going back and forth between the above, we let these ideas that we form in the focus mode bounce back and forth between different topics in our brain. You start associating topics to other things in your life. For example, let's say you're learning to surf and then realize that once you take a break from your first surf lesson, back in the day you skateboarded and those neural connections needed to form and realize some of the same principles that you had in skateboarding are the same as surfing, allow those connections to form when you're taking a break during diffuse mode. So that when you go for your second surf lesson, you'll actually be better prepared. Now, the key thing is that you can only be in one mode at a time. So we want to avoid multitasking. And focus mode and multitasking are different things. A lot of people think focus mode means having 50 windows open on your computer and being busy. But multitasking is usually a bad strategy because you can rarely do two things at once, especially well. There's actually a famous study by David Rock at the University of California at San Diego that showed when people do two cognitive tasks, that is, tasks that require brain power at once, their cognitive capacity can drop from that of a Harvard MBA to that of an 8-year-old. And it's a phenomenon called dual task interference. Essentially, it's a fancy way of saying doing two things at once is a surefire way to do nothing well. And remember how I said efficiency trumps grit as one of our pillars? When you need to start making an effort to learn, it's not about just being in focus mode for hours on end, working hard all the time. It's about taking breaks and letting your mind wander every once in a while, going for nature walks, making sure you sleep. Taking breaks is actually a sign of high performance, not weakness. And this is actually the smart strategy. You want to be super focused, then super diffused. I'll see you in the next one. Bye-bye. Let's talk about sleep. Guess what? Sleep is important. And I know what you're thinking. Oh boy, you're not really learning anything new. You already know that sleep's important. Why am I watching a course to tell me that sleep is important? Well, I want to talk a little bit about the science of sleep. Because yes, sleep is important, but some people actually underestimate how important sleep is to be an efficient learner. As a matter of fact, if you're not sleeping well, you're automatically at a disadvantage compared to everybody else that sleeps well. For example, I remember when I went to university, my very first test was a math test. And I thought I would do what most people do. Well, pull an all-nighter, wait until the very last day to study for a test, and then just don't sleep at night, study all night, and then in the morning, go take the test. Guess how well that went? Well, my very first university exam got me a great score of 10%. Not very good, is it? It was horrible. And although I could have been better prepared for the exam, the big reason that I wasn't able to do well on the test was that I didn't really sleep. My brain was tired, and as soon as I got the first exam question, I just couldn't think straight. And staying up all night to study for a test is the worst strategy you can ever have for long-term learning. Yes, maybe you learn a few facts here and there, but long-term, what I learned that night is definitely not in my brain anymore. For long-term learning, lack of sleep is just a horrible strategy. Here's an interesting study of why sleep matters so much. You see, being awake creates toxic products in our brain. And this is a recent discovery. When you sleep, your brain cells actually shrink, and fluids flow through these gaps, and they clear these toxins for you. So sleep is actually our brain's way of flushing out unwanted things in the brain. And this study was able to show that the flow of what we call cerebral spinal fluid in your brain increases when you sleep, and it flushes away these toxins that build up between your brain cells during the day. Now, the only reason that this can happen at night is that it's a very energy-intensive process. So you need to have the rest of your body shut down in order for it to work. As we learned in the previous lecture, sleep also accounts as the diffuse mode of thinking. When we sleep, it allows the brain to organize things, erasing the less important things and making the important things have more connections with different parts of our brain. And as Matthew Walker describes in his book, Why We Sleep, sleep allows us sometimes to come up with new and novel solutions. You might have encountered times where you're trying to solve a problem. You're trying to be focused on the problem and you can't solve it. So instead, you go on with your day, you go to sleep, and then the next day when you tackle that problem, the solution comes to you immediately. This is our brain working and helping us out while we sleep. Now, obviously, you can't sleep all day to be an efficient learner. You also need the focus mode in order to learn something. But sleeping is an important part where too much is not good, but too little is bad as well. Dreaming about things that you're studying actually improves your memory because your brain is working. The idea is that of balance. Don't sleep too much, don't sleep too little. Later on, when we talk about short-term and long-term memory, those all-nighters you pull are the easiest way for us to not retain any information. So when you have a choice between sleeping or not sleeping before an exam, well, definitely pick sleep. Your brain will be in a better state for problem solving and learning. Let's talk about brain training. We've discussed that your brain has something called neurons. These little cells right here. It's a cell that connects to other neurons or other cells in our brain. These cells are connected to each other by something called synapses. So every time you learn something new, your brain creates more synapses or these connections. So every time you learn, these connections are being created. That's the first step. Next, we want to strengthen these connections because over time, if we don't use these synapses, these connections disappear because memories sometimes fade, right? What you learn one day, you might forget another day if you don't use it. So you need to strengthen those connections so that these connections last a long time, so that these connections are strong. That's why we repeat things when we learn. Usually, the first time we do something, we don't learn it. We have to do it over and over and over. And we're going to get to that later on in the course. Simply put, if you forget something, it means that those connections aren't strong enough. The neuron connection, the synapses, are gone. They're not strong enough. So our brain is like a muscle. At any moment, it's growing or deteriorating. Your brain is never in just the same state. And when you're not exercising your mind actually atrophies and actually loses neurons. But when we use our brain, when we learn new things, neurons become linked together through repeated use. So you need to practice to create these strong connections. Practice creates stronger and stronger connections, and we learn that diffuse mode has a chance to build these strong connections, not just the focus mode. And that's why we don't do late night studying or we make sure that we sleep. We train our brain, we form these new neural connections by exercising it, and we exercise it by repeating what we learned. And when we start thinking of the brain as a muscle, something that you have to train, something that either is being atrophied or something that is growing, we start to realize that if we don't use it, we're going to lose it. Now, finally, when it comes to brain training, there's actually one other thing that's super important. And this is actually quite a new recent discovery. We used to think that when we're born, we have all the neurons at birth. That is, we don't create new neurons in our brain. It's just neurons connect with different neurons, and that was it. And neurons die if we don't use them. This new study found that in a few places, like the hippocampus, which is right around here in our brain, and it's used for memories, new neurons are actually created every day. And since new neurons are created every day when we're learning new things will keep them around. How cool is that? But then there's one other thing when it comes to brain training that is super important, and that is actual physical exercise. Because we learned that our brain is a constant state of movement, either growing or declining, just like our muscles in our body. But physical exercise, that is going for a run, going for a jog, lifting weights, playing sports, actually help with our brain because it allows us to be in that diffuse mode, to think about other things, to relax our brain. And that actually in turn helps our brain as well. So amongst just learning, also physical exercise, even if you're not thinking about anything, even if you're just daydreaming, is actually good for the brain. The key here is that we just need to use our brain. So now that we know how to train our brain, let's uncover some other topics that can help us with this brain training. Let's talk about the science of feedback. And when it comes to feedback, there are two types of feedback, right? One is negative feedback. No, you're not doing that right. No, you're doing that wrong. That's negative feedback. It's saying you're doing something wrong, so here's a negative feedback. Then there's positive feedback. Hey, if you finish your homework, I'll give you some candy. Hey, if you accomplish this one goal, then I'll give you some money. I mean, a job is a positive feedback, right? You work and then you get salary at the end of the month. And when it comes to learning, you need feedback because if nobody's telling you if you're doing something wrong or right, then you're just going blindly and you don't learn anything. So feedback is an integral part of learning. But let me ask you this. Which one's better? Is positive feedback better or is negative feedback better? Maybe you have a preference. Maybe you like being encouraged when you're learning something. Maybe you like being told what you're doing wrong when you're learning something. It's not absolutely conclusive if one is better than the other. As a matter of fact, as we'll learn, each one is good for its own right. But a recent study showed that experts, that is, people who are masters at a craft that were really, really good, vastly preferred negative feedback versus positive feedback. Why was that? Because criticism is usually more actionable, right? Instead of just getting compliments, hey, you're so good at this, you're so good at that, by getting negative feedback, you know exactly what to fix or what people don't like. So negative feedback actually appears significantly more effective for learning, especially when you're at a high level. And another study actually uncovered that for certain tasks, human learning system is actually capable of learning without any positive feedback at all. As long as you get negative feedback, you can actually learn. And you can't really say the same thing for just getting positive feedback without negative feedback. So negative feedback is a very important thing. Remember how I said both are important based on different situations? Well, positive feedback is actually great at the very beginning. When you're just starting to learn something, you get a lot of self-doubt. You get a lot of those obstacles where you think that you're not good enough, right? But when you have positive feedback at the very beginning, it gets you over those obstacles at the beginning. That's actually how children get good at things. Let's say you join the soccer team. Somebody tells you that you're good at soccer, or somebody tells you that you're good at math. You feel good. And because of that, you actually start to enjoy doing those tasks more. And eventually you actually become better than most people at soccer or at math because you keep doing those tasks that you enjoy more. So positive feedback when you're first starting out is a really, really good thing. But as you become more and more an expert, negative feedback is absolutely crucial. The key here is that no matter what, you do need feedback to learn. And without feedback, your rate of learning actually diminishes significantly. If we had two people and one person got minimal feedback and the other person got lots of feedback, that second person with lots of feedback is definitely going to outperform the first person in the long term. That's why people get coaches, right? You can train to become a professional basketball player by yourself at home, but the person who gets a coach and gets feedback, watches a video review of their plays, will outpace the first person very fast. There's no point learning something yourself from scratch when others have done it and others can help you along the way. You want to stand on the shoulders of giants. You want to learn from other people's mistakes, other people's experiences, so that you can accelerate your learning. Now, when it comes to feedback, the best form of feedback when it comes to timing is immediate feedback. If you want to be an efficient learner, you need to get feedback right away. If you're doing something wrong, you want to find out you're doing something wrong right away instead of waiting a week or a month. As Anders Ericsson says, which we'll get to shortly, he's a very important figure when it comes to efficient learning, mentioned that without feedback, either from yourself or from outside observers, you cannot figure out what you need to improve on or how close you are to achieving your goal. So without feedback, we're not going to be efficient learners. And we're going to use this feedback and uncover some techniques in later on sections to make sure that we get this feedback that we need in order to learn. We can't talk about learning without talking about procrastination. What is procrastination? Well, it's this, right? It's this idea of putting off something because you don't feel like doing it right now. And this is something that a lot of us battle with. As a matter of fact, everybody battles with procrastination. It's always easier to do the easy things, and the easy things usually don't require a lot of effort, which involves learning. But why are some people better at procrastination than others? Is that something that can be fixed? Is that something that can be trained? And yes, it is. You see, when you learn something new, it activates an area of the brain associated with pain, something with negativity. Your brain actually triggers negativity. And we don't want to do something that we don't enjoy doing, right? That's what procrastination is. Emotionally, we get this, I don't want to do this feeling, this negative feeling. And your brain immediately tries to switch off and tries to put your attention into something positive. That's why you don't want to do something. You don't want to do something because it's not going to feel good. So why not just go on Instagram? Why not just go on Facebook or watch YouTube videos that gives you that sudden jolt of feeling good? And that's what this recent study discovered, is that procrastination is an issue with managing our emotion and not our time. The tasks that we're actually putting off are being put off because it makes us feel bad, because it's boring or maybe it's too difficult, and we just want to do something that makes us feel good. Or maybe we're just worried about failing. To make ourselves feel better in the moment, we start doing something else like going on YouTube. So how do we get rid of procrastination? Is there a trick? Well, research has found that in order to get rid of procrastination, you just need to take the initiative and start doing the task. Wait. That's the worst advice ever, right? Because you just told me that procrastination sucks, but you can fix it by just doing something that you're procrastinating on. That's not very good advice, is it? Well, unfortunately, with procrastination, there's no easy tricks. At the end of the day, to get rid of procrastination, you need to do the task that you need to do. But what you can help with that is that realizing that Instagram or YouTube is a short-term positive thing. The pain you feel at the beginning when you start a task will actually make you feel better in the long term. So you need to realize that you're making a sacrifice of short-term positivity versus long-term positivity. It's delayed gratification. Another interesting study was done by Case Western Reserve University in Ohio. And they did an interesting study. They first prompted people to feel bad by getting them to read a sad story, and then they got people to do a puzzle. They had one group that read the sad story before they did the puzzle, and another group that didn't read any sad stories. What they discovered is that the people who read the sad stories first were more likely to procrastinate than those that didn't. Why is that? because they were looking for something positive to change their negative emotions. Remember when we talked about the happiness factors in the principles section of the course? You need to be happy if you want to avoid procrastination, because procrastination is that avoidance of negative feeling. But if other parts of your life are happy, if you feel positive, then it's a lot easier to overcome the procrastination because you don't have so much negativity. So that's what procrastination is. The way you avoid procrastination is just being in a good mood and knowing that initially it's not going to feel good. You need to realize that procrastinating to achieve a short-term positive thing is at the cost of a long-term goal. So next time you're tempted to procrastinate, you simply just say, what's the next action? What's the simplest step that I can take to take on this task? All you need to do is to get started. Because as soon as you get started, what scientists discovered is that negative feeling tends to go away fairly quickly. So getting started is everything in order to avoid procrastination. Make it as easy as possible for you to start. And that's something we'll get into the techniques section. For now, don't pause this video, don't go on YouTube, don't go on Instagram. I'll see you in the next video. Bye-bye. This is going to be a fun one. Let's talk about long-term and short-term memory. In order to understand how our brains work, how efficient learning happens, we need to understand these two topics. So what are they? Well, long-term memory is stored in different regions of our brain. These memories are all over our brain in different spots. The way we create long-term memories is to create that memory and then continue to revisit it a few times in order to make that stronger and stronger connection in our neurons. We need to practice and repeat. Just like riding a bicycle, right? We learn to ride a bike by practicing it over and over. And although you might take 5 years in between riding a bike, you'll always know how to ride that bike because you've done it over and over and over. Long-term memory is formed by practicing and repeating. And long-term memory is extremely important when it comes to knowledge and learning because that's where you put fundamental concepts and principles that guide your life. When you learn something new in school, you usually use your long-term memory to remember things that you've learned in the past, maybe basic math concepts, maybe geography, and using those concepts and principles to learn something new. These fundamental concepts and principles are stored in your long-term memory so that as we grow older, in an ideal situation, we're able to learn things better and faster and connect them to different parts of our brain. But how do we get this long-term memory in the first place, right? Well, we need to start off with short-term memory. And short-term memory is also sometimes called working memory. Although they're slightly different for our purposes, and working memory and short-term memory actually describe different processes, short-term memory and working memory usually involve our prefrontal cortex, so that is the front part of our brain. Unlike long-term memory, which is all over our brain, working memory and short-term memory is just involved in the front part of our brain. And scientists discovered that we can usually hold what we call 4 chunks of information when working with short-term memory. That's why when we need to go to the grocery store and somebody told us, hey, can you buy apples, carrots, oranges, and grapes? You have to repeat those in your mind to not forget. Or when you're given a phone number, it's often easy to remember 4 numbers, but any more than 4, it becomes difficult. For example, 4719. If you repeat that, you should be able to repeat it now. But if I gave you 81723056 and tell you to repeat that 1 minute from now, that second one is going to be a lot harder because our brain can hold usually just 4 chunks in short-term memory or working memory. But the connection between this short-term and long-term is important. You want to move this short-term memory to long-term memory. That's how long-term memories form. Initially, they're in the short term, and then over repeated use, it gets stored in long-term memory. Now, you can do this using a technique called spaced repetition, which we're going to talk about a lot in this course. The idea is to repeat something over several days, which means doing something 20 times in one day is not going to be as good as doing something 20 times over 20 days. Each day doing that one thing once. That's why we don't want to cram for an exam. We want to do small things repeatedly over time. Remember when we learned about neurons and strengthening the connections of those neurons in our brain? That's the process of putting things into long-term memory. The more things you can connect a concept with, the more connections form, the stronger those connections form. Let's use an example. Let's say we want to learn about the god Ra, the god of sun when it comes to ancient Egyptians. How can you store Ra into long-term memory? Well, we now hold Ra into our short-term memory in one of our 4 chunks, but now we need to connect Ra and repeat the idea that is Ra into different parts of our brain. Now, we might revisit this page tomorrow and then the next day and then the next day until that memory sticks. But we can also connect it to different concepts that we have already in our brain, in our long-term memory. For example, Egypt and the god of Ra. How can we remember him? Well, you can associate it with that time that you went to Egypt to see the pyramids. Or maybe associated that time that you met somebody at Halloween who was wearing this exact skirt. Or maybe you remember that time that you had ramen and it was really, really hot. And that ramen kind of sounds like Ra. And Ra, sun, it's hot ramen. You make those weird connections in your brain. And that's how you're going to remember Ra. And I guarantee you, by the end of this course, you're going to remember Ra as the god of sun because I just talked about hot ramen. So let's go back. We know that short-term memory is for something that you're currently working on. And when you need to bring long-term memory into something like working memory, you can sometimes solve problems that are currently in the working short-term memory by using the concepts and principles you learned that are stored in your long-term memory. So the process is often that the long-term memory, we use recall to recall some long-term memory, and then we use the short-term memory to consolidate and reconcile our knowledge. And then we practice and repeat over several days to add things into long-term memory. Just like we learned, our brain needs to be trained, and memory is just like a muscle. Our brain is a muscle that can be trained. Now, the sad thing is, as humans, we forget a lot of things that we learn over our lifetime. And research shows that within just 1 hour, if nothing is done with new information, that most people have forgotten about 50% of what they learned. After 24 hours, this amount increases to 70%. And if a week passes without that information being used, up to 90% of it could be lost. That's scary, right? So to improve knowledge acquisition and learning and retention, new information must be consolidated and securely stored in our long-term memory. You will notice that what we've learned up until now actually helps with this. The idea of sleep, of focus and diffuse mode, the idea of the Feynman technique to teach something, to check that you know it, to repeat it. The idea of spaced repetition, an important technique we'll discover in an upcoming video, all allow us to move from short-term memory to long-term memory so that we don't lose what we've just learned. I'll see you in the next one. Bye-bye. Let's talk about active versus passive learning. What do those really mean? Well, just based on the name, it should give you a clue that active learning is probably what we want to do, and passive learning is probably not the best. You see, you learn more by active engagement instead of passive learning, which is something like passive listening. For example, listening to podcasts, watching YouTube videos, watching other people demonstrate things is what we call passive learning. You're learning by just doing the easy things. Active learning, on the other hand, actually involves being involved, practicing, and actually taking down notes, trying to solve problems yourself. Practice is key here to connect the dots. In order for connections to form in your brain, you need to actually take the action and practice, not just be passive. You see, passive feels good. Passive is easy. It makes us feel like we're being productive. So we do it and we think that we're learning efficiently. For example, you're learning how to play soccer? Well, just watch a couple of videos on YouTube. You're learning how to program? Well, just watch a bunch of tutorials on YouTube and never build your own projects. That's passive learning. Anybody can be a passive learner. You can listen to podcasts on 2 times the speed and pretend like you're learning something. But the people who actually learn, who actually excel and surpass those who do passive learning are those active learners. They actually practice what they learn. They actually go out with a soccer ball and start kicking it around, start practicing. They start coding and building their own projects and making mistakes. Let me ask you a question. What's better? Is rereading material better, or is recalling or remembering material better? For example, if I gave you a sentence, and this sentence you can either reread 5 times or you can read it once and then try to remember it, well, it turns out that practice and recalling is the better way of learning. Before you create a mind map or connect the dots, recall comes before connecting the dots. The key is that you are the one problem solving. You're trying to remember information from your brain, bring it to your working memory, and actually use it. So you're the one that's trying to bring that information back. If somebody gives you a problem and you just look at the solution, that doesn't help. Your brain hasn't worked to reproduce those steps. And this is what we call the illusion of competence. You need to actually create the connections in your brain, actually practice, and actually do things and let your brain work as if you're doing that task in order to truly learn. You see, retrieving knowledge from your long-term memory actually improves one's ability to retrieve it again in the future. And we learned that in the previous lecture, right? Practicing this retrieval of retrieving information from our brain produces actual meaningful long-term learning. For example, when I was in grade 7, I had a geography teacher that all she wanted to do was to teach us every single country and every single capital in the world. That's it. That entire semester, that geography class, all we needed to do was remember all the countries and all the capitals of the world. And to this day, I know all the capitals and all the countries in the world just from that one class. Because throughout that semester, what we had to do is constantly recall and get tested what we remember of the world map. So that instead of just watching a map and just reading, letting her talk about each country, instead, we got to test every week to try and recall every country and every capital. And we did that over and over and over until it became so ingrained in my mind that it's a knowledge that I still use to this day, even though I learned it in grade 7. And that's why the pillar of the Feynman technique is so useful. Because with the Feynman technique of teaching somebody a concept that you learned, it creates that recall in our brain. And it also allows us to take away the key important parts of that information. When we share something with a friend, we recall that information, but also digest it in a way that just keeps the important concepts. When you have something like Google to always search things for you, when you have Google Maps to always find directions for you, when we use a calculator to always do our math problems, it weakens the part of our brain that allows us to solve math problems ourselves. But the key takeaway from this video is that 1 hour of studying versus 1 hour of test are 2 different things. The test, the 1 hour of testing, is actually better for your learning than the 1 hour of studying. That's why rereading is usually a terrible strategy. Because rereading something or watching YouTube videos, it's too easy. In the book, Make It Stick by the following authors, they state that the more you repeat in a single session, the more familiar it is and the less you struggle to remember it. Therefore, the less you learn. Learning that's easy is like writing in sand, here today and gone tomorrow. So, although it doesn't seem intuitive, just repeating something blindly is not as good as recalling. You had to actually struggle to remember something. And passively consuming information is an inefficient way to transfer that information to your long-term memory where you can put it to use later on. To engage our brains, we must move beyond just reading a text, viewing a lecture. Actively start taking notes, write summaries, ask questions, apply what you've learned, and get regular feedback to assess what you just learned. That's why I'm not a big fan of courses that teach you how to be a fast reader to double your reading time, because that's not actually improving your learning. Fastest doesn't mean most efficient. And note-taking is a great way to slow down. You learn complex concepts by trying to make sense out of the information you perceive, not by having someone else telling it to you. You need to put your knowledge to practice. Let's talk about the science of motivation. You see, at the end of the day, it's hard to focus on a topic you are not interested in, right? You have to have motivation to do something. And when it comes to motivations, there are two types of motivation. One is what we call intrinsic motivation. Motivation that comes from the inside. We're motivated to do something because of who we are, because of what we believe, because of what we want. It comes from within. And then there's external motivation. Things like money, like salary, like gifts, like presents. We sometimes do things for external motivations, things that come from outside of us. Now, in the book Drive by Daniel Pink, he discusses the idea that you need intrinsic motivation, intrinsic drive to learn and to learn efficiently. And how do we do this? He gives us 3 intrinsic motivations or drives for us to learn and continue to learn. One is autonomy, that is to have control. We want to work on things that we want to do and that we have control over. We want to work on things that gives us control of our lives. The second is mastery. We're intrinsically motivated to be masters of something, to be good at something and to be recognized by others as being masters of a skill. That makes us feel good. And then finally, we have the third, which is purpose. What is our purpose? How does this benefit myself and others around you? What is my destiny? At the end of the day, you can learn how to learn. You can learn how to be an efficient learner. But without internal motivation, without actually having the drive to want to learn, no trick is going to do the job for you. And there is a famous effect in psychology called the over-justification effect, which occurs when an external incentive actually decreases a person's intrinsic motivation to perform a behavior or an activity. Researchers actually found that when something like money or prizes, which are external rewards, are given for actions that people actually find intrinsically motivated or intrinsically rewarding, they actually become less internally motivated to pursue those activities in the future. For example, if you've always enjoyed playing the piano and you become a professional pianist, and all of a sudden your job becomes to play the piano, maybe you don't get that motivation anymore. Maybe when you come home from work, all you want to do is not look at a piano. That's the effect. That's the over-justification effect. Now, this isn't to suggest that extrinsic motivation is a bad thing. Money is important. Gifts, presents, sometimes are important. And extrinsic motivations can actually be beneficial in certain situations. It can actually be helpful when a person needs to complete a task that they find unpleasant. Like, remember when we talked about procrastination? When we're looking to procrastinate, something like an extrinsic motivation, like if I do 5 minutes of this, then I can have a cup of coffee. Then I can have a piece of chocolate. That actually helps when it comes to a task that we find that we procrastinate on. So external rewards can actually help us do things that, as an individual, we had no initial interest in doing. So when we're just starting off to acquire a new skill or a new piece of knowledge, extrinsic motivation and rewards are really, really good. However, once these early skills have been learned, for long term, you need to start becoming intrinsically motivated to pursue that activity. It's great when you start to learn how to play the guitar and you get extrinsic rewards. But after a while, if you're not internally motivated to become better and better at playing the guitar, you're not going to pursue the activity. Remember in the lies section of the course, we talked about this idea that to follow your passion is simply a lie? This is what we're talking about. When you follow your passion and then you suddenly get paid for it, it doesn't become a passion anymore. What drives you should be internal. The idea of learning, of improving. If you're learning machine learning, the idea of becoming better, of getting respect from others, of having autonomy, mastery, and purpose over our work is what will drive us to continue to push, to continue to learn, to put ourselves in those uncomfortable situations of active learning to become better and better. So the key takeaway is here to put yourself in a situation where you can be praised for your learning. If you're surrounded by people who praise you for learning and getting better, having good friends, having good social connections, having a community of people that support each other, well, that's actually going to help with your intrinsic motivation because you're getting better and better at something, and getting better at something feels good. And when you're being recognized for that, that's going to drive you for success. Let's talk about goals, because without goals, we don't know where we're going. We need some sort of a roadmap. Now, setting big goals is exciting, right? But it's also scary. The larger the change we want to make, the more scared we become. And that's actually part of our brain. There's a region of our brain called the amygdala, which actually handles our emotions and detects fear. And it's what triggers our fight or flight response. When we suddenly feel something strong emotionally, such as being scared or being uncertain, the amygdala responds by immediately trying to seeking out comfort and finding something that can help us avoid this feeling, which actually hinders our learning. It's hard to concentrate and it destroys our long-term goals. Now, to overcome this idea of how do we accomplish our goals? How do we get to where we want to be, which seems so far away? Robert Mueller in the book Kaizen offers us a solution. Kaizen is a Japanese word for continuous small incremental improvements. The idea is to take small steps towards a goal. And this way, we avoid triggering the amygdala's fear detection system so that the entire time we're not going to give up on our goal. We're not going to feel like we're never going to get there. And this way, by taking these small steps, we eliminate the fear of failure. And we remove that desire to stop towards our goal. The smaller the steps we take, the easier it becomes for us to create those neural networks in our brain and create positive habits. Now, this idea of small incremental steps are actually mentioned in quite a lot of books. One of the books that we'll talk about is Atomic Habits by James Clear, of making those small little habits to improve and go towards our goal. It's not a new idea, but it does consider one of the principles we learned, right? This idea of compound learning. It's all about making those small goals, small little steps each day that over long term is going to compound. It might be hard for us to see how we're ever going to achieve mastery, but we can accomplish a lot over 10 years, over 20 years. The idea is to not make the goal too big. The idea of small targets that you can hit consistently is what we want to do. And when we talk about habits later on in the course, this idea of just creating a small habit, of doing something just for 2 minutes, and setting a goal like if you want to go for a run, to say, I'm going to run 5 times a week for 2 minutes. By making a goal so simple and so easy, I mean, anybody can run for 2 minutes, right? By just forming those habits, by having those clear goals, we're more likely to accomplish something in the long term. Now, we've all heard about this idea of SMART goals. If you haven't, well, a simple Google image will show you all these diagrams of what SMART goals are. It's this idea that our goals should be specific, measurable, achievable, relevant, and time-bound. Now, we're going to do an exercise where we learn what these goals are, how to actually create good goals so that we have a clear roadmap to success. But the one takeaway from this video is that goals don't have to be big. As a matter of fact, all we need are well-defined, specific goals to succeed. For example, Anders Ericsson, which we're going to do an exercise on in the next lecture, had a test subject called Steve Falloon. And by the end of the study, Steve Falloon was able to recite 82 digits by memory. And how was he able to remember 82 digits? Well, because on the first day, he could only do 4. Each day, he tried to improve his memory by increasing to 1 digit. When he could remember 27 digits, well, now his next goal was to remember 28 digits. Each day, all he had to do was improve by 1. And if he didn't, the next day, he had the same goal. Now let's explore this idea of goals and how to create efficient goals that take advantage of how our brain works. It pays not to be busy. We live in a world where being busy is almost like a badge of honor. Being busy is good. It means that you're being productive. It means that you're doing important things, right? Well, as we'll find out, being busy is not a good thing. It's not a good trait. If anything, it shows that you have a lack of time management. Now, not to upset you or anything, but let's get started here. We learned that we have a region of the brain called the hippocampus, which is crucial to learning. And new neurons are born every day in the hippocampus. Now, because new neurons are created, we need to nurture our brain. We need to use our brain. We need to train our brain to make sure that these neurons don't deteriorate, that we are actually using our brain and keeping it strong. Now, one of the things that can actually improve these neurons in our hippocampus is to be surrounded by people, surrounded by others. There's been studies where if you put an animal by itself, it weakens the strength of the neurons versus if you have a rat surrounded by others. You want to be surrounded by other people who are stimulating you. And things like exercise also does that, where it stimulates your brain. But at the same time, when you're being busy, when you're constantly working, when your brain is constantly on, you're doing things, you're checking email, you're checking your text messages, your brain doesn't have that moment of pause. Remember when you used to get recess at school? That's actually extremely important for your brain to develop. We learned about the focus and diffuse mode, right? The idea is that healthy, leisurely time is absolutely key. One study found that what distinguished concert-level violinists from those that were just good were that the concert-level violinists were able to actually have leisure time. They weren't constantly on. They were able to take breaks and relax their brain. There's many stories of people like Einstein who used to take naps throughout the day. Famous, smart people who used to sleep for 10 hours at a time in a day. If you find yourself being constantly busy, realize that that isn't a badge of honor. You're actually doing a disservice to your brain. If you want to do something efficiently, if you want to be an efficient learner, taking breaks and not being busy is actually a better strategy. Find a way to not be busy. More does not always mean better. And we learned in our pillars that efficiency trumps grit. And the good news for people out there is that being busy, being always on, always doing things, and not taking breaks is actually a bad long-term strategy. The good news is that taking breaks in the long run will actually make you more successful. So hit that pause, walk away from your computer, your laptop, go for a walk, and I'll see you in the next video. How do you become a software engineer? How can you program a robot? How do you solve this extremely difficult problem? Now, we learned up until now that we have this idea of focus mode of thinking, where we're so focused on a task, that's where we start gaining that knowledge. And then we combine it with the diffuse mode of thinking. Now, when we focus on something, we create chunks of knowledge. That's what we're doing. When we learn something, we're creating neural patterns and connecting them with pre-existing patterns in our long-term memory. By focusing when we're learning something, we don't have random things popping in our head. We focus on those 4 chunks that we're able to store in our working memory, and then we create chunks with our focused attention by understanding and practicing a topic. For example, if you're learning how a car works, you're not going to learn how a car works right away. You're going to break down how each part of the car works and then combining the missing pieces to create the whole system, to understand how the whole system works. If you want to become a rocket engineer, you need to form different chunks of knowledge and combine them to actually learn how everything works together. And this is the idea behind chunking. You need to understand how chunks in your brain relate to one another. For example, we all remember math class. A lot of us learned math and found it extremely confusing. Calculus, for example, seemed like we were creating graphs and charts without really understanding why we're learning something. It seemed like we're just learning a little puzzle that doesn't really apply to real life. How does it apply to your life? That's why math sometimes is so hard for people, because it just seems like we're playing games that are unrelated to everyday life. And we learned in active versus passive learning that we have to actually do things, actually practice to create these chunks of knowledge. Now, this idea of chunking, of breaking things down into different chunks, is sometimes called bottom-up learning. And that is this idea that we start from the bottom and go up. We combine different chunks of knowledge and we connect the dots between these chunks. We create a mind map. This is why I introduced the mind map at the beginning of this course. This idea of these are the different pieces of knowledge that we're going to combine to create this overall understanding of efficient learning, of learning how to learn. This demonstrates chunking. We're breaking down into each lecture this idea of efficient learning. Now, that's bottom-up learning. What we also need is something called top-down learning. That's something where we start with the big picture. What is this big landscape of learning? What is the big picture here? And by combining this top-down learning of what is the big picture, how do you connect the dots with the bottom-up learning of what is this individual chunks of knowledge and how can I use them, can create really strong long-term learning. This idea of chunking is actually described in Barbara Oakley's book, Learning How to Learn. If we form different knowledge and chunks, it's all great. But without having also the top down of connecting the dots, seeing how each chunk relates to one another, then we might have these tools, but we won't know when to use that tool. The idea is to gradually build chunks in our minds. And these chunked mental library will create different patterns. And when you learn how to connect them, how you can relate concepts to different things, using diffuse mode to connect far distant chunks. It's what creates knowledge. This idea of connecting the dots is absolutely instrumental to long-term learning. So start with the chunks of chunking different pieces of knowledge, then look at the top down. How do all these chunks connect? And let your brain work towards connecting these chunks. This is why the trunk-based knowledge we talked about in the pillars is so important. We need to have these foundations and principles so that we're able to connect these chunks, these different leaves, to one another. How to solve problems. This is the most in-demand skill guaranteed for the next 20 years. How can I make such a bold statement? Well, think about it. Work, jobs are literally that. They're people paying you money to solve problems. When you have unique skills, when you have unique abilities to solve problems, that's when what you learn becomes valuable to others. And this idea of solving problems is what's going to make you successful. Hopefully you're taking this course in order to learn efficient learning because you want to get to a point where you have a valuable skill that most people don't have so you can solve problems. So how do we solve problems? Well, there's two ways that we can solve problems. One is within the focus mode of thinking. When we're focused on something, it's really easy for us to solve problems that require that focus mode, where sometimes these problems are sequential. Do this, then do that, then do this. But there's also another way of solving problems. It's a way to solve problems in the diffuse mode of thinking. Sometimes these problems in the diffuse mode are solved by what we call intuition, by ideas or creative solutions. We often think that to solve a problem, we always need to be focused. Don't get me wrong, being focused when solving a problem is important. But as solutions become less intuitive, as solutions become more creative, harder to grasp, you need to also use your diffuse mode. Think about the time that you spent so much time on a problem and you couldn't solve it. And then you finally went home, came back the next day to work and found a solution right away. Some problems are better solved with different ways, sometimes focus, sometimes diffuse mode. And learning which way to go and going back and forth between different strategies is part of being a good problem solver. Welcome back. This is an important one and a topic that is a must for anybody that's looking to become a master, and that is deliberate practice. And deliberate practice, as we're going to discover, is going to teach us that the learning process should be tough. Temporary frustrations when learning is a good thing. Now we finally get to talk about Anders Ericsson, which I've mentioned a few times already. He wrote a book called Peak, which is one of the most important books when it comes to learning. And in his book, this idea of deliberate practice gets mentioned quite often. Now, Anders mentions that rock climbers, chess players, and all of these masters can usually visualize things, visualize all their moves ahead of time. They're able to create experiences in their mind, make accurate predictions, and keep a lot of information in their mind. The way they're able to do such things isn't just natural talent, but it's deliberate practice. So what is deliberate practice? Well, deliberate practice usually happens like this. You start to learn a topic, and initially you have rapid progress. That is, things are good at first. You're learning so much at the beginning that you see yourself progressing more and more each day. But then eventually, we always hit what we call a perceived limit, where we start to plateau. And because we don't get that immediate progress that we saw in the past when we were just beginners, we start to get a little bit of frustration where we don't see ourselves improving. We've plateaued. This is where deliberate practice comes in. We want to be just in this area where we're finding a bit of frustration. And for us to improve, we need to have deliberate practice. That is, we're right on the edge of our limits and we're trying to push through to suddenly get a breakthrough and go back to that rapid progress. And then repeat that cycle where we hit a limit a flat area, and then we practice at this edge, at this uncomfortable edge of our limits, and then move past that. Now, in order to have deliberate practice, we need, according to Anders Ericsson, we need specific goals. We need intense focus. We need immediate feedback. And we need that frequent discomfort by being at the edge of our abilities. And this idea of deliberate practice goes hand in hand with the idea of passive and active learning. It refers to the specific type of practice that is actually what we call purposeful. While regular practice might include things like mindless repetition, deliberate practice actually requires us to be focused, getting that immediate feedback and having that specific goal to know where we want to be. As Anders Ericsson describes it, deliberate practice takes place outside one's comfort zone and requires a student to constantly try things that are just beyond his or her current abilities. Thus, it demands near maximal effort, which is generally not enjoyable. That's right. Unfortunately, deliberate practice is not meant to be fun. It's that practice that is a struggle. It's that area where you feel like you're not good enough. It's pushing yourself to your limits. So, how do we get to the state of deliberate practice? Well, one, we need to make sure that we have periods of undistracted focus. We need that focus mode of thinking for deliberate practice. Next, we need to push ourselves to the edge of your ability. You want to make sure that you're cycling between comfort and discomfort, where you're trying something and learning something and pushing your limits where you find a task too difficult, too hard for you to do. Next, to seek immediate feedback and mentorship. So get help from somebody. Let's say you're learning how to code. Well, try to build your own project and find that it's super difficult. Then you start reaching out to your peers, to your mentor, to your teacher, and seeing if they can help you out with your problem. At the end of the day, there's a reason that you have people that you admire. Famous people like Elon Musk, or Jeff Bezos, Roger Federer, or any type of master. All of them do deliberate practice. And deliberate practice is uncomfortable. If you want to achieve great things in your life, this is simply something you need to do. You can't just achieve things by luck, by not trying. The good news is that the better you get at something, the more enjoyable it becomes. Now, I want us to remember the dip here, because we talked about this idea of obstacles, but also this idea of dip, where we encounter sometimes things that might not help us toward our future goal. Maybe we have unrealistic goals where we actually should turn around and not pursue to become that professional basketball player. Now, there are genetical influences when it comes to performance. Yes, some people are born with better genes than others. Yes, some people have better opportunities than others. Sometimes you're dealt a hand of cards, and that's what you have to play with. But each of us have our own deck of cards. Each one has a hand that has been dealt. But deliberate practice can actually help us maximize our potential. Each of us have different potentials, but by doing deliberate practice, you maximize your hand. You maximize the cards that have been dealt to you. It turns our potential into our reality. Now, to end this video, you might be wondering, what is this image of? This is Kendo, or the way of the sword. It's a Japanese martial art, and it has an interesting lesson to teach us about deliberate practice. For that, I'll see you in the next lecture. Let's talk about spaced repetition. This is probably one of the best, most repeatedly proven way to improve learning. And we will actually revisit this during the techniques section as well, because it's so important. And the idea is that revisiting and practicing what you learn is important. Because research shows that spaced repetition, which is repeating things after a few days, is the best way to build and strengthen the synaptic connections in our neurons to improve memory. That's why we want to avoid cramming, which doesn't build solid neural structures. The idea is to put just as much time as you would have cramming, but instead spacing it over a long period of time. For example, if this was a graph of our learning, we learn something and then as time passes, we start to forget it. But then we do spaced repetition. We spend another day remembering and practicing that skill. Well, that improves our learning. And then again, as time passes, we forget a little bit, and then we learn it again, and then again, and then again. Eventually, our learning, although it's always constantly in a dip, it improves with each repetition that we do, because each time we're strengthening our connections in our neurons. The main takeaway on this point is not to spend too much time in one sitting going over the same material over and over and over again. The law of diminishing return applies here. It's the idea that you don't need 12 hours a day to learn a topic. Your time can be better used efficiently when learning when it's spread out over many sessions, and even over many different modes of learning. You will notice that I placed these lessons not completely in sequential order, or an order that may make sense to you. And I'm trying to take advantage of spaced repetition here. I've mentioned the topic of spaced repetition now a few times in this course, so it should trigger something in your brain. We also talked about focus and diffuse mode several times in different lectures, again, improving your understanding of focused and diffused mode of thinking. By this point, we should have talked enough about diffuse and focus mode that it almost becomes natural to you. You can explain this concept. You can use the Feynman technique to explain this to a friend. That's what spaced repetition is. The idea that cramming is not a good strategy, but repeating things, doing things over and over, taking each day to do one thing well, or each week, once a week to do something over long term really help you build those neural connections to create those long-term memories. Just like spaced repetition, habits are something we're going to talk a lot, especially in the technique section of this course. But in the science part, I want you to think about habits as energy savers. Habits are formed by humans so that we don't need to focus when performing different habitual tasks. By having habits, our brains can not be so focused on a task. For example, brushing our teeth. It's very easy for us to brush our teeth because we formed that habit. It's almost mindless. We can daydream when we brush our teeth because we've done it so many times. It's an energy saver. Our brain can only work so hard by forming these habits. Well, now I don't have to think about brushing my teeth. But as soon as you change your hand and you try to brush your teeth with the opposite hand, it suddenly becomes harder. You have to think about it. You have to focus on brushing your teeth, and your brain now works harder. I want you to start thinking of habits as energy savers for your brain. And research has actually shown that writing your daily list the evening before, such as your goals, actually helps you accomplish your goals the next day. And now, why is that? Well, it's because we're saving energy in our brain. If you write down what you need to accomplish the next day, well, it takes away from our brains having to work on writing down that goal the next day. So when we wake up, we already have something written down that saves our brain from using up valuable memory slots. And that's why habits like putting your workout clothes next to your bed when you wake up actually helps you exercise more, because you don't have to think about where's my shirt, where are my shorts, where are my sneakers. Everything is done for you. These habits that we're going to discover later on in the technique section actually allows our brain to not think, to not focus, so that tasks that help us learn, that help us progress, become easier and easier. The key takeaway is that habits that we're going to form are going to be energy savers to save our brains on specific tasks that require our attention. Be adventurous. Whoa. What is this? Another motivational YouTube video? Well, no, not really. Most scientists today agree when you gain new experiences, when you are experiencing new adventures, your neural pathways are actually strengthened in your brain. We remember things when we're in an adventurous state, when our emotions are high, when you're experiencing something new, our memory is actually sharper. We remember things more clearly. And additionally, some scientists actually believe that even greater changes in adult brains can be accomplished by doing new things. When you learn new things, when you experience new topics, explore new locations, something that's new to your brain actually grows our brain, actually creates new pathways that previously weren't able to be created. And the key here is that monotony is bad. If every day you wake up and you do the same thing over and over and over, it's not creating strong neural pathways. It's not going to create unique connections that people who are adventurous and experience new, different, and exciting things are going to form. One of my favorite quotes growing up was, "The world is a playground. You know that when you're a kid, but somewhere along the way, everyone forgets it." Think about that. When you're a kid, you're able to be creative. Think of different games. Think of different stories, different ideas, just because you're creative. As we grow older, this idea of creativity almost disappears or becomes less and less so. That is because our experiences become sometimes monotonous. We start to experience the same things over and over and over. And if you want to be an efficient learner, don't shy away from new experiences. It doesn't have to always be about learning. It could be about traveling to a different location. It could be taking a different path to work than you usually do. It can be learning a skill completely unrelated to what your job is. The idea is to be adventurous, to experience new things, to avoid monotony, to treat the world like you did when you were a child, because that actually helps your brain grow. Have an endpoint. When it comes to performing unpleasant tasks, your brain actually needs to know that there is an end in sight, that there is an endpoint. What does that mean? Well, when you're planning on working on something, tell yourself that I'm going to be done by this point. No matter what, by 5 p.m., I'm going to stop working. I'm going to give my brain a rest. And we know that about brains, that we need rest. We need to take breaks. But giving yourself a break and establishing exactly what time or when you're going to finish your focused learning session, and by knowing that in advance, it actually helps your brain stay more focused. Daniel Kahneman, who's a famous psychologist, actually mentioned this, where no matter what, he never had any all-nighters in university. There was always a specific endpoint where he knew what his productivity hours are, something we discussed about in the principles section of the course. And he would just stop working when he knew that you're no longer being productive. Plan your finishing time. And by planning your finishing time, it becomes just as important as planning your working time. When was the last time that you were bored? Can you remember? You see, we actually live in a world where boredom has become less and less common. When I was a kid, I remember so many times when I used to be bored. We didn't have smartphones with all these apps, games, and internet all around us. It was very easy to be bored. And recent studies have shown that this lack of boredom that we experience in our day-to-day lives, less and less, is actually bad for us. Being bored is actually an important thing. It allows that diffuse mode of thinking to happen. It allows us to think of creative solutions, to think about things, to strengthen our neural connections and create those connected chunks of knowledge and form them into long-term knowledge. Being bored is actually quite important. And being constantly distracted by listening to podcasts, always browsing the internet, watching YouTube videos is actually bad for our brain. And in the next lecture, we're going to learn a little bit more about science of boredom and how being bored is actually a good thing. And by the way, if you're thinking, wow, Andre's lessons are so boring, maybe this is just a strategy for me to make you a better learner. Think about that. Okay, maybe not. Maybe I'm just boring. I'll see you in the next lecture. Bye-bye. Holy moly, that was a big section. Just a lot of science for you to remember, right? We talked about the very important concept of focus versus diffuse mode of thinking and how learning happens by going back and forth between these two things. We learned about how important sleep is and the science of sleep. We learned that the brain can be trained just like a muscle and that we need to constantly improve it, otherwise it's going to deteriorate. We learned that feedback is absolutely crucial to learning, and sometimes negative feedback might be better than positive feedback. We learned that procrastination has to do with our emotions, with our brains trying to avoid that negative feeling and how to overcome it. We learned about long and short-term memory and how we can use short-term memory to improve our long-term memory. We learned about active versus passive learning, how passive learning is easy, but not necessarily as effective as active learning, of testing, practicing what you learn. We learned about the science of motivation. Motivation is important, and especially intrinsic motivation that comes from the inside is important for long-term growth and learning. We learned about goals and how important they are for us to write down our goals and have specific, clear goals that allow us to have a roadmap to success. We learned that being busy is not necessarily a good thing. As a matter of fact, if you find your life busy, then there's ways that you should improve and remove things from your life so that you give yourself a break. We learned about chunking, how we can connect different pieces of information in novel ways to form unique concepts and ideas. This idea of using principles and foundations to form new pieces of knowledge. We learned how to solve problems, that we can solve problems in focus mode and diffuse mode, that there's different techniques for solving problems. But at the end of the day, the ability for you to solve problems, it's what's going to make you successful in the future. We learned about a very important concept of deliberate practice. This idea that when we practice, we have to be right at the edge of our abilities, to be uncomfortable and really push ourselves to the edge, and also have mentors or coaches in order for us to get immediate feedback of how we can improve, to always push further and further. We learned about the important concept of spaced repetition. This idea that we repeat things over and over and over, spanning across multiple days, weeks, or months in order to form those long-term memories. We learned that habits are simply energy-saving mechanisms of our brain. It allows us to do things without using our brain too much so that our brain can focus on learning. We learned that being adventurous is a good thing. Having new, unique experiences, being surrounded by things that stimulate us, actually makes our brain remember things and learn things better. And then finally, we learned that being bored is not a bad thing. Being bored sometimes can be good for our brain. At the end of it all, what we learned in this section is that our brain is not static. That is, we're not born with a type of brain and that's what we have for the rest of our lives. The brain is a fluid thing. It's constantly changing. It's constantly growing, constantly deteriorating. And what we do with our brain, just like our body, just like our muscles, is up to us. We can choose to improve it, or we can choose to just let it deteriorate. The choice is up to you. And I hope by the end of this section, you're convinced more than ever that it's something that we can take care of. In the next section, we're going to learn how to take care of our brain, the techniques that allow us to use what we've just learned to become efficient learners. I'll see you in the next one. Bye-bye. Let's talk about concepts versus facts. What's the difference? Well, the difference, and what I'm going to try and convince you in this lecture, is that concepts are more important than facts. Now, why is that? Well, you have facts which are just that. They're facts. They're things that you can just Google and find out. Dates, when somebody was born. What's the biggest company in North America? These are all facts. But facts are easy to Google. We have Google for facts. Concepts, on the other hand, are hard to Google for. Sometimes you can find them, but concepts are mainly used for your brain. Remember when we talked about repetition versus recollection? When you recognize something, when you repeat something over and over, it's actually not as effective as recalling something. For example, when we highlight a textbook and you go back and read through the highlights, that's actually not a good strategy. A better strategy is to actually highlight a book and then go to each section, and before you look at the highlights, try to recall what you learned in that section and then test yourself by reading over the highlights then. Recognition versus recollection. Recollection is important. In order to store something in your long-term memory, you need to recall something, not just recognize it. And we learned again this topic of active learning versus passive learning. Active learning is this idea of testing yourself to improve that memory, that recall. And recall is one of the best ways to really help your brain chunk information. We chunk information by having these small little chunks of knowledge and then connecting them to different things in our brain to create concepts. How are things related to one another? That's what concepts are. Concepts are high-level topics that give you context of what you learned, of the world around you. Concepts are valuable. Facts are cheap because anybody can learn facts, right? It doesn't require any special power to retain facts. But the people that get paid well in their careers, the people that are respected in their careers, are people that have these chunks of knowledge that they can connect the dots with, and they have concepts available to them. For example, CEOs of big companies are able to solve difficult problems that don't have an immediate answer because they have different concepts that they can use. These high-level concepts are what they're able to do to connect different chunks of knowledge to form a novel solution. This is why the trunk-based knowledge way of learning is so important, because you start with the foundation and the principles. And once you have the foundation and the principles in place, it's a lot easier to learn these smaller leaves, the smaller topics that often change, and there's many of. And this is why whenever I learn something new, I always try to focus on the foundation and principle first. Being able to answer, why am I learning this? Why is this topic important? And asking that question, just like a 5-year-old does all the time. Why this? Then why? Why that? Being able to connect the dots and ask why really forms this idea of building your concepts versus your factual knowledge. And at the end of the day, that's what the Feynman technique teaches us. In order to have these concepts, you should be able to teach it to somebody. If you're just understanding facts, you wouldn't be a good teacher. If you understand concepts, though, and you can explain concepts, then that's somebody that truly knows a topic. All right. This technique is kind of a repeat of another one, but I do want to mention it again because it is important, and there's a few things that I want to add. This is the idea of testing yourself. We talked about it when we discussed passive versus active learning. Without practice, you're never going to get anywhere. That's as simple as that. You can watch all the soccer videos in the world. You're not going to be a professional soccer player. You need to practice. You're not going to be the best singer in the world by watching people sing. We learned also about deliberate practice to actually push yourself to your limits. This idea of self-testing is super important. It's uncomfortable. It's so much easier to just watch a bunch of YouTube videos and feel good about yourself. But at the end of the day, you have to ask yourself, when you're learning a topic, to pause every once in a while and say, what are the key ideas? How can I summarize this? A good way of doing this is when you're reading a book, every once in a while, take a pause and take notes. What did you just learn in the last couple of chapters? Try to quiz yourself. Maybe you're listening to an educational podcast. Instead of playing that podcast at 2 times speed, instead, pause every 20 or 30 minutes and then write down a summary of what did you just learn. Because we learned that rereading or watching videos is not the best learning strategy. At the end of the day, you need to quiz yourself. You need to recall information and see what you did wrong. The key here is that just going to school, taking a multiple choice test, and then getting a score back doesn't help you. In order to test yourself, you need that feedback. So if you get something wrong in school or when learning, understand why you got it wrong. Write down why you got it wrong and fix that problem. If you want to learn, you have to do the uncomfortable. And the uncomfortable is to test yourself and fail many times and learn from your mistakes. Oh boy, we just learned a ton of techniques. Seems a little overwhelming, right? But remember what I said. You don't have to remember all of these. Just pick and choose some of the techniques that we learn here. But let's do a fun little exercise. And this one's called the first 20 hours. Pause the video and try to think of a topic that you want to learn, a skill that you want to acquire. But this time, we only want to focus on what you're going to do the first 20 hours. We've done exercises like this already in the course, but I want us to really finalize things with the techniques we have learned. By the way, this idea of first 20 hours was popularized by Josh Kaufman. And he has 2 really good books. One, it's called The First 20 Hours, and the other one is called Ultra Learning. And both of these books are really interesting because Josh argues that you don't need to become a master of a skill. We all strive to be masters, but you can actually acquire this good enough or valuable skill quite fast. As a matter of fact, sometimes within the first 20 hours. Now, this obviously sounds too good to be true, but it's an important concept that we often think we're so far away from a goal, but there's things that we can do in the first 20 hours to really propel us, to really get us as far as possible to continue on our road towards mastery. So pick a skill, a topic that you want to learn, pause the video, and try to think what you would do in the first 20 hours based on the techniques you just learned. All right, ready? Let's get started. So the first thing I would do, and you should hopefully know this by now, is to create a learning map, a roadmap to what you're going to learn. What's the strategy that you're going to take in these 20 hours? Next, knowing that we need to test ourselves and have active learning, I want to design practice drills. What am I going to practice? How am I going to test myself? So based on what I want to learn, how am I going to know that maybe every hour I've retained whatever I learned? Now, Josh also advises of doing something called overlearning. Now, overlearning is something I already talked about that I actually advise against because it's not an efficient way to learn. Josh mentions overlearn as a way to go beyond the requirements, to go beyond what most people try to achieve within the first 20 hours. So it's just about being ambitious. So this is a point that you can decide for yourself. I personally prefer doing the overlearn technique over a long period of time instead of all at once because that leads to burnout. Now, the next thing I would do is I would make sure that I have some sort of a good feedback system. Is there a coach? Is there a mentor? Is there a buddy that I can talk to and keep myself accountable? Maybe even have some rewards and stakes in place in case I don't finish whatever I set out to do in the first 20 hours. Then I'll maybe combine it with the Pomodoro technique and doing short and intense practices combined with breaks in between, and also making sure that I sleep well at night. But we also only have 20 hours. So based on what skill or learning I wanted to do, I want to break down the skill during my road mapping phase to different sub-skills and different chunks to deconstruct to the essence of that skill. What's the Pareto principle? What's the 20% that's going to give me 80% of the results? Then we start off by learning the most critical skill first. And then finally, in those first 20 hours, I want to make it as easy as possible for me to actually not procrastinate and finish that task. Have everything around you with no distractions. Make all your senses alive and make yourself feel good. And making it as easy for me to stick to that 20-hour period. So, give it a go. What are you going to learn over the next 20 hours? And at the end of 20 hours, share it with us in our Discord community and let us know what you just learned in 20 hours and whether you were efficient or not. And if you found some interesting techniques or advice that you found works for you, do share because I bet many people would benefit from it. I'll see you in the next one. Bye-bye. Holy moly, we did it. That was a lot of techniques, a lot of things to remember, but hopefully you were taking notes. And again, hopefully you have these videos to come back to and be reminded every once in a while of some of the techniques that have been proven to work for efficient learners. Techniques that are scientifically proven and also empirically proven. We learned about the Pomodoro technique, that little cute tomato timer of 25 minutes on, 5 minutes off, the focus and diffuse mode of thinking. We learned about chunking the subject, the idea to divide and conquer a topic, and forming chunks of knowledge in your brain that you can connect the dots with. We learned about spaced repetition, how we can use spaced repetition to fix that forgetting curve and improve our abilities to store things in long-term memory. We learned about deliberate practice, one of the most important concepts when it comes to mastering a skill of becoming valuable, and that is to push yourself, be on the edge of your abilities, and making sure that you're always asking yourself, how can I improve? Is this giving me butterflies in my stomach? We learned about creating a roadmap, having a clear plan of the direction that you want to take, of a plan that you want to take in order to get to where you want to be. We learned about the idea of interleaving, that is, combining different skills together, learning through different techniques, not always focusing on the same subject or the same technique of learning every single time. Interleaving and going back and forth between different techniques, different skills, to intertwine our brains to work and form different ideas and concepts. We learned about this really difficult German word, Einstellung, which simply means this idea of rigid mind, how we want to keep our cup empty so that new ideas can flow and not be too stuck in our ways because knowledge is constantly evolving. We learn about the importance of community. Humans are social creatures and we need people around us. We need people to support us, to motivate us, to keep us accountable. And we can't do things efficiently if we're just by ourselves. We learned about the power of habits and how we can form smart habits to make it as easy for us as possible to be efficient learners, to use as little willpower as possible and form those habits, those good habits of efficient learning. We learned about systems versus goals, how it might be good to have systems in place that are not rigid, that allow us to stick to a goal longer term. We learned about the power of the senses, this idea that our emotions, our senses, need to be present for a memory to really stick in our brain. And using our senses when learning will improve our ability for long-term memory and recall. We learned about the Pareto principle, the 80-20 rule. What's the 20% that's going to give us 80% of the results? It wasn't just about selecting the 20%, it was also about eliminating the 80% that's not important right now. With all the information we have in the world, we're now at a point in time where there's too much information for all of us to learn in our lifetime. Instead, find the critical piece of information that you need. Start getting good at eliminating things and focusing on the critical things. Next, we learned about Parkinson's law, this idea that we fill up our work with the given time. So give ourselves a specific deadline. And because we tend to procrastinate, and by time boxing or using different time frames for us to do a task, we limit ourselves and our laziness of our brain from doing the work and working on something without giving us too much leeway. We learned about stakes and rewards, how we need internal and external motivation and reward system for us to feel good and to constantly learn and to constantly push ourselves. But we also need stakes, something on the line, something to hold us accountable. What happens if we fail? What happens if we don't do well? At the end of the day, we need something on the line. We can't always have that safety net, and we need to take risks in order for us to be accountable and to push ourselves and try to avoid failure. Then we did some exercises. We learned about deep work, how unlike shallow work, deep work requires intense focus, intense problem-solving skills. And it's the type of work that is going to be protected from machines and automation taking over your job. We learned that concepts versus facts is important. Facts are easy to remember. Facts can be Googled. Concepts, on the other hand, come with experience, with chunked knowledge, and those are the valuable skills that will last a lifetime. We learned that testing yourself is important. We can't be passive learners. We have to be active, and we have to form strategies of how we're going to test our understanding. How do we practice our understanding? Finally, we talked about the first 20 hours, that you can be good enough at a subject maybe within the first 20 hours. And having the right strategy in place in those first 20 hours may be critical in us getting motivated to continue learning on a subject. But the strategy of efficient learning is important. And ladies and gentlemen, that was it. That was the top of the pyramid, the techniques. But because we laid the foundation of principles, lies, pillars, and science, I hope that the techniques section was intuitive. It made sense. It made it stick. Because we laid the foundation of these techniques, and we should understand why these techniques work. It should be common sense now. It should be easy for us to remember these techniques throughout our lives, so that now we have these good study habits, these learning habits to become efficient learners. Good job getting this far. I'll see you in the next one. Bye-bye. Holy moly, you made it. Here we are at the end of it all. Thank you for being part of this course. Thank you for trusting me to take you in this journey. I know that your time is valuable, and I truly appreciate you taking a leap of faith with this course. Now, if you followed along diligently, did the exercises, really took in the information, and wrote down notes, you are far ahead of most people. Your journey, though, is just the beginning. The Zero to Mastery philosophy is the idea that we will always need to learn. We will always need to adapt to different situations. We embrace this statement. The statement, you suck. Because we know this means we have an obstacle to overcome to make our brain stronger. Failing is a way for us to get stronger. The ability to learn more efficiently than your competitors and colleagues will be the main competitive advantage of the future. Once we become good at one thing, we move on to the next, because life is a long journey of learning. So your career path, your life plan, is to just keep learning. We learned that our brain, the more you use it, the stronger it gets. The way you grow it is to not do the easy things, right? It's when you struggle with things, when you get those butterflies. Your brain grows when you get a question wrong, not when you get it right. When you get things wrong, when you make mistakes, that's a good thing. But I want to leave you with one last thing. Remember, you need to enjoy what you are learning. If you don't enjoy it, in the long run, those who enjoy it will win out. So make sure you are learning something that you enjoy. You now have the tools necessary to go from zero to mastery. Thank you for being part of the Zero to Mastery community, the community of self-learners who never stop learning. I hope to see you again. Thank you, and bye-bye.